baby.
Indiscriminately firing thousands of workers, including hundreds of people who oversee our nuclear weapons and handle air safety for the FAA. We'll talk about all that and why I'm never flying again.
I feel the same way, man. I don't have any of your flying anxiety, but how many plane crashes do we have to watch on TV?
Yeah. I mean, we were prepping for this while one happened. Another one from Delta flight from Minneapolis to Toronto.
How does it get upside down?
I don't know. I guess
Don't
there's
the wings
bad
block
winds,
that?
but I don't know. Well, we'll talk about why the FAA is being hollowed out at this moment. We'll also talk about how Donald Trump now essentially owns the Democratic mayor of New York City, thanks to a corrupt deal that led even Trump-appointed conservative prosecutors to resign from the Department of Justice. Then, Tommy talks to Stephen A. Smith, the legendary sports commentator turned political pundit, now one of the Democratic Party's top critics, about what he thinks the party needs and why he hasn't completely ruled out running for president.
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right. I mean, for those who don't watch sports or ESPN or listen to sports talk radio, like Stephen A is a legend in the game of winning arguments and shouting down opponents in the most entertaining way possible. And there's been all this chatter about him potentially running for office is sort of like the reason I wanted to reach out. But also, he's a guy who understands the digital economy and attention and how to get it and drive a narrative and keep it better than almost anyone. And so, look, listeners, there's going to be a lot of criticism of the Democratic Party. Some I agreed with, lots I didn't. You will repeatedly think, why isn't Tommy interrupting him and pushing back on this? And to you, I say two things. One, Stephen A is legendarily difficult to interrupt. There's bodies littered across ESPN of people who have tried. And two, that's not what I wanted to do. Like, sometimes it's good to hear criticisms that are wrong, but like a widely held perspective. And not everything he said was wrong. Even if it makes you mad, like it's good to hear where people are coming from and what they're mad at the Democratic Party about. And we can learn something.
You can't Daniel Dale everyone throughout the interview, you know? Otherwise, people aren't going to get much.
Long interview, too.
Also, it's impossible to interrupt him. I went on his podcast before the election, and that was slightly different because he had to ask me some questions because he was hosting the podcast. But it was the full Stephen A. treatment. And it was just...
I'll tell everybody, this was everything I wanted and more out of the Stephen A. experience. I felt like I got yelled at for 30 minutes in a good way.
Yeah.
And about 10 words in, and it was all I wanted.
Perfect. I can't wait to listen. We are recording this Monday afternoon on President's Day, soon to be known as President Trump Day, probably. I'm shocked he hasn't renamed it.
Funny but real.
Our dear leader has sent a U.S. delegation to Saudi Arabia to begin negotiations with Russia to end Putin's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, which over the last 3 years has led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, the kidnapping by Russia of tens of thousands of Ukrainian children, and a global alliance led by the U.S. and Europe to isolate and deter Putin from expanding the war and potentially using nuclear weapons, both of which Russia has expressed interest in doing at some point during the conflict. Ending this war is, of course, a worthy goal to pursue. We all want that. But what's scaring the shit out of Europe and Ukraine is that Trump has so far excluded them from the negotiations with Putin and hinted that, wittingly or not, he may give the murderous dictator most of what he wants. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron called a last-minute meeting of European leaders in Paris to talk about how to handle all this. I guess they'll just be watching Twitter for updates like us.
Yeah.
Is that about right, Tommy? Look, what did I miss there? How big of a deal is this, and why are Europe and Ukraine so freaked out right now?
Doing it in Saudi Arabia is a nice touch. It's kind of like an autocratic human centipede. You know what I mean? Hopefully you don't know what I mean. There was a lot of activity on Ukraine last week. It kicked off when Trump called Putin for 90 minutes, and they set up this series of peace talks between the U.S. and Russia on the future of Ukraine. Not a part of those talks is Ukraine or the Ukrainians or Zelensky. Zelensky got a call after the Putin call where Trump informed him that this was going down.
More of an FYI.
Yeah. So, hey, man, heads up. 20% of your territory is being occupied by the Russians. We're going to figure out who gets it.
This is the first time a U.S. president has spoken to Putin since the war began.
Since the invasion. Basically, this effectively ended 3 years of trying to isolate the Russians by the West, basically, this call. And, you know, the Europeans are also not invited to these talks, which, again, is nuts because the EU and its member states have given something like $145 billion worth of support to Ukraine over the past few years. And they're obviously more threatened by a Russian military operation than we are because we have an ocean in between. So it was really messy. And then on top of that, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense / America's designate, if there's ever a case race to decide the future.
but not to get home.
Not good at flip cup, though. Surprisingly bad. You and I could take them. But so Hegseth announced at a meeting in Brussels, a NATO meeting, that it was unrealistic for Ukraine to join NATO or get back all the territory it lost since 2014, which is like maybe true and a fair thing for like an analyst to say. But everyone was like, hey, man, you're part of the team now negotiating with Putin, and you just gave him massive concessions before these talks even started. And then he walked it back, and then they kind of walked back the walk back. So it was just like amateur hour left and right from Hegseth.
And then Trump said he potentially supports readmitting Russia to the G7.
Yeah, why not? G8.
G8.
We're G8ing it up.
Bring
them back.
He said many people on both sides were to blame for the war in Ukraine. Just a callback.
Never says...
Callback to the first term.
Yeah, never says Russia invaded. Very strange.
I also thought it was amazing that... I'm sure you guys talked about this. I don't know when it happened, though.
No, it all happened after we recorded.
It happened all happened? Okay.
Yeah.
How about the fact that Trump was going around being like, okay, I know that it seems like I'm going to give Russia what they want, but hey, Zelensky, if you give me half of your minerals, maybe I'll give you more of what you want. But there's a deal to be done there.
Yeah, I forget who handed this sort of proposal to...
Hey! He has homicidal tendencies.
Zelensky, but it basically said Ukraine gives the United States half of its deposits of rare earth minerals in exchange for nothing. There was no security guarantee. There was nothing. Zelensky was like, "What do I do with this?"
He's really focused on these rare earth minerals,
that too.
like a feudal lord.
NBC
He wants
immediately
it
He wants it
goes
from
down and goes
Greenland,
to battle.
Canada, Ukraine.
Well, you know what they're very important for is electric vehicle batteries, and I wonder who might be talking about that in his ear.
I thought we hated electric vehicles now.
Well, no,
I
but-
thought we were able to drive our gas guzzlers.
Now they're cool.
Okay, so why should Americans care about all of this right now?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned at the top, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed or wounded or are missing because of the war. The war led to inflation, energy prices skyrocketed across Europe, and all those impacts rippled out across Europe and destabilized all these governments. And Biden gave all this direct support to Ukraine, rallied the world behind Ukraine, and now Trump is just selling Ukraine out and selling Europe out. And so there's this enormous fear that division within NATO, weakness within NATO will lead Putin to do more, to go into a NATO country like Poland. I mean, I think the Danish intelligence services recently said that if Putin perceives NATO as weak, Russia could launch another large-scale war in Europe in as few as 5 years. And the whole point of NATO is to deter these things. So this is like a seismic shift in U.S. foreign policy.
I saw in the Financial Times, too, that some of the Europeans think that Trump wants to potentially remove U.S. troops from places in Eastern Europe, and some of the Baltic nations.
I think what happened was Hegseth went to Brussels, then he went to the Munich Security Conference, whatever, some mouth breather thing that Rhodes would attend or did attend.
And probably has, yeah.
And I think he suggested in some of those meetings that they might pull tens of thousands of U.S. troops out of Europe.
And so this seems like the broader danger beyond just the danger for Ukraine, right? Which is just signing some kind of settlement where they lose some of their territory and they don't get the security guarantees from the United States so that Putin can just reinvade. But that now Eastern Europe, now Putin thinks, okay, well, I got my way here, and Donald Trump's a pushover and is just going to give me what I want, either a pushover or a fellow autocrat. Right. And then starts menacing Eastern Europe, and then we're off to the races.
Yeah, there's sort of two really bad... Look, this war's awful. I'd love it to be over. I'd love for Putin to take his troops and go home, but it's going to require sacrifices from both sides, I think, to get to a peace deal. And some of the things Hegseth was saying are true. I mean, basically, the Bush administration in 2008 set up this construct where they kind of floated Ukraine for NATO membership, but they didn't get into NATO, which left them very vulnerable, sort of the worst case scenario. And I agree, it is unlikely that Ukraine will be a part of NATO, and it is unlikely that Ukraine will get Crimea back. But I think the worst case outcome here is a negotiation where Putin keeps a lot of territory, Ukraine is forced to basically demilitarize and gets no security guarantees, and Putin uses this period of time to reconstitute his forces and then just roll tanks into Kyiv, and then after that, maybe he rolls tanks into Poland or somewhere, a Balkan country, and then, there's like a hot war happening in Europe between the Russians and NATO is weakened, and like that is the long-term nightmare.
Good times.
Yeah.
Good times. Well, we should also dig into J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which is a big part of what has freaked out Europe over the last week. So instead of talking about America's commitment to European security and a free Ukraine, he said that the real threat to the continent isn't Russia or China, it's that Europe's leaders aren't welcoming enough to extremist parties like Germany's AfD and aren't sufficiently committed to free speech. A statement made without a hint of irony from an administration that has banned the Associated Press from covering the White House for refusing to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. So stupid to even say that. And is currently investigating media outlets for coverage that makes Trump mad. Here's some of Vance's speech.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values shared with the United States of America. I look to Brussels, where EU commissars warn citizens that they intend to shut down social media during times of civil unrest the moment they spot what they've judged to be, quote, hateful content. And I really do believe that allowing our citizens to speak their mind will make them stronger still, which of course brings us back to Munich, where the organizers of this very conference have banned lawmakers representing populist parties on both the left and the right from participating in these conversations. If you're running in fear of your own voters, there is nothing America can do for you. Nor, for that matter, is there anything that you can do for the American people who elected me and elected President Trump.
A stirring defense of freedom from J.D. Vance.
Yeah, putting the eunuch in Munich there. Thanks, JD.
What was your reaction to the speech, and what do you think Vance was trying to do there?
I have three thoughts. The first, big picture, I think JD is cut out of all the big boy meetings. And he saw Pete Hegseth go over to Brussels and screw up these Ukraine negotiations and then get slapped around because Trump didn't like the coverage because he looked like a bad negotiator. Everyone's like, oh, art of the deal guy. You just gave up all these things to Putin. So JD decided, I'm not touching the hot stove. I'm not going to talk about the hot war that's happening in Ukraine that matters. I'm going to talk about social media and free speech.
I'm going to go to my safe space,
exactly.
Which is whining about mean people on social media, which is what he actually, it seems like that's what his job is, because he's just posting all the time.
He's attacking the most random people on social media all day long.
Yeah, he's just a professional poster, and he's mad about it, and he wants to go talk to the entire world about it.
But seriously, can you imagine like the White House comms meeting where you're like, yes, let's send the vice president to this Munich Security Conference, first overseas trip, huge deal, and then not talk about the single biggest issue facing Europe?
I mean, it seems like there's two different parts to the speech and what we just heard in the clip. The first is he is very upset about the content moderation laws that the EU has passed and adopted.
Right.
Though I think he is overstating the case of what the enforcement mechanisms are. And look, they are much stricter, certainly, than anything we have in the United States, because we don't have anything.
Well, it's going great over here with no rules.
Right, no rules, right. But the idea, like, the EU will define sort of hateful speech as speech that is inciting violence or hate in sort of an immediate sense. Like that is the definition that they've done. And so what they can do is fine social media platforms and demand that social media platforms take down the free speech. But what he laid out there was like, they're going from house to house and you're not allowed to say anything bad.
Yeah, right. Jackbooted Facebook thugs. Yes, they are complaining about kind of routine censorship. And remember, this was kind of Mark Zuckerberg's thing that he cried about in his Joe Rogan interview, is he wants the American president to be a champion for American companies and just let us do whatever we want. Then there's this question of this Romanian election where there were 2 rounds. The first round went off. They figured out there was all this Russian interference, so they canceled the second round, which is a more controversial thing. But again, talking about that lets JD say, Russian interference in elections, what a ridiculous thing to care about.
Right.
Likes that. And then I know hypocrisy is irrelevant now, but JD Vance didn't have anything to say about Viktor Orban, their buddy, who is the dictator leading Hungary, who's like swallowed up all independent media.
Well, also, all of their complaints about free speech are such fucking bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're sitting here in the United States banning the Associated Press. Elon Musk was tweeting today that 60 Minutes deserves a long prison sentence.
What?
Yes.
I
I guess the whole show.
How do you...
The whole show.
Every episode.
The whole all
Leslie
of them.
Stahl?
Leslie Stahl. All of them are going to jail.
Even
long prison sentence.
Even the dead ones. I guess not.
It's just it's such fucking bullshit.
Right.
They do not give a shit about free speech.
Speech they don't like. Well, there's another Germany-specific piece to this. Just allow me to geek out for a second. Germany's got an election on the 23rd, so in a week. They're going to elect representatives to the Bundestag, their parliament, and then they'll choose the next chancellor. The most likely outcome is that the CDU wins the most votes. That's Angela Merkel's party, the Conservative Party, and that they go into a coalition with the Social Democrats, and that'll be what happens. But right now, the AfD, the far-right party, is at 20 or 22%. And that is scary because most Germans are repulsed and terrified by the AfD because they are viewed as dangerously close to being neo-Nazis. Members of the AfD downplay the Holocaust. They kind of wink and nod and accidentally, in air quotes, use Nazi slogans. German intelligence has said some factions of the AfD are actually extremist groups. And because of Germany's history with the Holocaust and World War II and, sure everyone's familiar with that.
Yeah.
They take this stuff very seriously, and all the other major political parties have ruled out working with the AfD. And in his speech, J.D. Vance said, quote, "There's no room for firewalls." And that's referencing specifically the firewall that these other political parties have between themselves and the AfD. And J.D. Vance also met with the leader of the AfD while in Germany, and this comes after Elon Musk has been propping them up on Twitter over and over again and doing Twitter Spaces stuff. So this meddling, it might have backfired, but they are openly boosting this far right, some would say neo-Nazi party in Germany.
What is there an explanation for this you can think of that is not J.D. Vance thinks it's cool to align ourselves with a far right German party that is the successor to the Nazi party?
It's anti-Muslim, anti-refugee,
immigration stuff.
Immigration, fringy stuff. I think J.D. Vance is smart enough to know this is wrong and pretty dangerous, but this is the program, and he's going with it.
Before we move on, your thoughts on the whole AP Gulf of America debacle? Because this has become a whole thing now here, but it seems like some press is pushing back. I saw the White House Correspondents Association has put out a couple statements.
Were they strongly worded?
They were strongly worded.
Very strongly worded.
I did read them, and I thought about, in the first Trump term, some of the statements from the WHCA were pretty just terrible, I would say, pretty limp. And this one was strongly worded, but I don't know. I don't know how the Associated Press gets back on Air Force One, gets back in the White House briefing room. They had to turn in their credentials, and this is all because they refused to call Gulf of Mexico Gulf of America, even though they are a global news organization, and no one fucking owns the Gulf of Mexico. It's an international waters, so other countries are calling it the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah,
bro, his neck is getting so red.
About this? Shout out Eugene Daniels and the Correspondents Association. This is not an easy one. I mean,
no.
Well, initially this seemed stupid and childish, and I kind of thought the Trump people would be dicks for a couple days and then let it go. But then Axios had this report this morning where some White House staffer I'd never heard of unloaded the clip of anger, things they're mad about in the AP style book. And it was truly Orwellian, And it just read to me like a literally unconstitutional assault on free speech. I know the Constitution singles out no law written by Congress shall abridge free speech, but that has been applied to the executive branch as well. And you're right, there's been a lot of strongly worded, high-minded statements, but no one's doing anything.
Yeah.
And it made me think about in 2009, when we were in the White House, the Treasury Department offered up a series of interviews with this guy, Ken Feinberg. What was he, like the pay czar?
Yeah, he was the pay
czar. And Fox News was left out. And all the other outlets came together and they said, we're going to boycott this interview unless you include Fox. So we included Fox. That kind of action is what's necessary. And
that was complaints about a single interview,
a Treasury aide.
Yeah, one interview.
Yeah.
Not we didn't try to kick Fox out of the White House.
Right. And it was a huge story. Robert Gibbs, the White House press secretary at the time, was getting hammered about it. Reporters were doing tons of stories about it. And there's been coverage of this. And, Jake Tapper, who was hammered us hard at the time, was incredibly sanctimonious about it. I've seen him do some, commentaries and things on his shows. I'm not seeing that from many other people.
Yeah,
I say that as a compliment to Jake.
To
by
Jake,
the way.
well,
He stood up for the principle there in a strong way.
It's a tricky one, right? Because first I thought, okay, maybe they should all just boycott the White House and stop, and band together and start reporting. It's like, you don't want that, right?
Because Cat Turd's the pool reporter.
Exactly. Yeah, there's already enough of cat turd types in there, so you don't want that. But I'm wondering, what else you do? What you could do is next time you're in the Oval or next time you're at the White House briefing room, just pepper Carolyn Levitt or Trump when you see him with questions about this, and don't move off the topic until they do something. Just make it a bigger deal.
It's really hard. The reporters, when they would take up issues like this with us, knew we cared, and we cared about what they thought, and they knew the Democrats cared about what these reporters said about how we were treating them. Trump views them as a foil. They want this fight. They love going after the media.
Yeah.
So it is hard, but there's got to be some sort of collective action that leads to a reduction in coverage somehow, something Trump doesn't like. And I don't know what it looks like, but they got to find it.
I mean, I think it is indicative of a collective action problem in dealing with Trump, writ large, in this term, right?
Sure,
it's for the press, it's for Democrats, it's for business people standing up. No one wants to get out there ahead of everyone and potentially put themselves at risk, either financially or their safety, or it's heading into bad territory here.
Yeah. Today's presenting sponsor is Simply Safe Home Security. Love is in the air, but so are porch pirates and other threats.
By visiting helixsleep.com/cricket. All right, back here in the United States, Trump celebrated President's Day weekend, a holiday dedicated to a man who believed America should never have a king and another who saved the Union, by declaring that it's okay to break the law as long as you think you're doing it to save the country. This is the quote attributed to Napoleon that I mentioned earlier, which was not only posted by Trump, but by the official White House account, just in case we weren't sure if they really meant it. Of course, actions speak louder than words, and there were plenty of those too last weekend. Trump and Elon continued to carry out legally dubious mass firings of non-political federal workers charged with frivolous jobs like keeping our nuclear weapons secure and making sure it's safe for us to fly. And in case you find it troubling that two brain-rotted billionaires are destroying the government we pay for, take it up with Fox and Friends' Brian Kilmeade.
Why does the media have such a hard time believing that two powerful, successful, handsome men could work together with one objective? It's happened before, and America accepted it. Remember, for example, Lethal Weapon? 4 separate times. Mel Gibson, Danny Glover. Watch.
This is not the biggest problem here at all, but does Brian Kilmeade think that Trump and Elon are hot?
How do you wake up and look at yourself in the mirror and then go to work and be like, I gotta read this today?
It's just the Lethal Weapon.
Our guy, Jesse Waters, he says the absurd thing with enough of a wink that he knows he's full of shit, but enough of his audience takes it literally that he can he doesn't pull it off, but Kilmeade did not pull that off.
Nope.
That was just is this guy to get hit in the head with a hammer before this part? What happened here? What is he talking about?
No, it's just regime media.
And
that's what it is now.
Did you see all the Twitter sleuths who found that Elon is a big Napoleon fan and has tweeted about it all the time?
I did see that.
And they think that's where this came from.
I mean, it's fucking nuts.
They're trolling, right? They want us to react. They want us to freak out, but we should.
Well, and it's also
want
but
Napoleon.
again, if watch what he does, not what he says. If he wasn't acting in that manner, it would be one thing. It would be a troll. But he's trying to break the law. Now, look, I will say on the Doge stuff and all the cases that are going through the courts right now, the Justice Department, the Trump Justice Department, is in their filings basically saying like, yeah, we're going to follow the rules, we're going to follow the laws here, whatever the court decides, that's great. So they are so far abiding by the law in their filings. I think the shit hits the fan when a Supreme Court ruling comes down that Trump doesn't like. Correct. And then we'll see if he still abides by the Napoleon quote that he's stealing. Let's talk about the firings. Maybe you think these workers are just paper-pushing bureaucrats or lefty political hacks or just people who weren't needed or doing a good job. Nope. They fired hundreds of workers at the Federal Aviation Administration over the weekend, the FAA, including people responsible for radar, landing, and navigational aid maintenance. That's according to the AP. Trump and Elon have also fired more than 5,000 employees at our health agencies, according to Forbes, including people who run Medicare, Medicaid, and the Department of Veterans Affairs, more than 3,000 people at the Forest Service, and Politico reports that, quote, fire safety projects are already frozen and being canceled all over the West. And maybe the most telling news, Trump and Elon fired about 300 employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration, which oversees the assembly, storage, and testing of our nuclear weapons. About 30% of the layoffs were at the Pantex plant in Texas, which is where warheads are actually assembled. So
that's the bad part of the nuke.
That's the bad part.
Yeah, you don't want that part.
That's it. You want to keep eyes on warheads. You want someone to be watching the warheads, for sure. So this happened on Thursday evening, and a lot of the workers didn't even know they'd been fired until they showed up at work the next morning and couldn't get in. But here's the worst part. There's actually a worse part.
The guy who brought a new comb to work on it after hours.
Now he can't get back in. Yeah. So once the absolute fucking morons in charge of our government realized that maybe they shouldn't have fired the people who oversee our nukes, the Trump folks tried to rehire them, but according to NBC, quote, struggled to find them because they didn't have their new contact information. And they had completely deleted all of their email accounts and information.
That's so crazy. What are we doing?
I mean, I'm no pollster, but I have a feeling that the voter support for a more efficient government doesn't extend to the mass firing of the people in charge of our nukes and our air travel. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, these are not people working on silly-sounding USAID projects overseas. People, the NNSA, that's a serious organization. I mean, also firing FAA officials in the wake of all of these plane crashes just seem nuts. And it does feel like Trump is kind of playing with fire here. And the question is, do these stories get to people before something bad happens? Right? Is this Delta crash in Toronto going to change the TikTok algorithm so that the Chinese think we all want to be fed FAA news and maybe people will hear about this and be like, what are you doing? Or does something really bad have to happen? I hope it's not the latter.
I mean, we need to, everyone's always wondering, like, what can I do? What can I do? Tell people these stories.
Right.
Like, I feel like Twitter is now just like pissing in the ocean, posting on Twitter because it's like a right-wing hellscape, but there's still journalists there, so I keep doing it. And I started like posting some of this on Instagram.
Oh, look at you.
Which I'm just like,
Cross-platform.
any platform that's there, like go fucking tell all your friends about this.
LinkedIn.
Because it's not, first of all, I mean, like, the press is already struggling for some of the reasons we just mentioned and just larger financial structural reasons that we've talked about for years. And also, even if they weren't struggling with all that, there's just so much of this happening. Like, you can miss the news for half a day and suddenly realize that, oh yeah, the nuclear weapons people were fired, and also FAA people were fired. Oh, there was another plane crash. Like, it just is happening so fast, and there's so much of it that I think it's really hard to keep up with.
I agree.
But
can I give you my really pessimistic version of how this would go, and the one that makes me scared is my worst case. There's a worst case scenario. Something catastrophic happens. And then there's the thing I worry about is government government services just get shittier and shittier and shittier. And in some cases, it's small. Like, you go to a national park and the bathroom is disgusting because they fired all the people who maintained it. And then there's really, really, really bad things, but won't be like national news. Like, a veteran will call the VA suicide hotline and it won't be sufficiently staffed.
That happened.
Right. So there'll be things like that happening
The,
over again.
the mental health, the crisis, the VA crisis hotline, the people who staffed it, like they didn't have enough people to staff it because they just laid these people off.
Right. Or like the bird flu explodes and we're not monitoring it. But my fear is people have such little faith in government that it might fold into those pre-existing feelings and angers at the government that Trump kind of exploited in the first place, rather than lead them to think, oh, actually, this guy's making it worse. Let's course correct. That's my pessimistic fear.
So my pessimistic fear, I'll give you mine, is that I think when government services that people count on break down, they will want to blame someone. I think Trump and Elon and the Dogebags and all the rest of them have become very skilled at just blaming Democrats.
Right.
And even though Democrats don't control everything, there's always some deep state puppet somewhere that they haven't gotten rid of that they can blame. There's always a Democratic governor somewhere or a Democratic mayor or
Right.
a Democratic...
Or
Joe Biden, right, that they can blame. So they will... Bad things
Trump
will happen,
literally did
and I worry
that
that they will continue to
with-
blame
talking
whoever
about
they can who's not them.
inflation the other
because
day.
I think there will be anger when a lot of this stuff happens. And you're already... And look, there's already stories about federal workers, which Trump and Elon and everyone assume are all like big libs. And there's some who, because federal workers aren't just in D.C., they're in every state in the country. Yeah. And there's like this one guy from Kentucky who like posted on Facebook or LinkedIn or whatever. It was like, I voted for Trump 3 times and I just had a great performance report. I've been at this agency forever. I'm trying to help people out. And I can't believe that this president that I trusted would just fire me for no apparent reason. That's the thing, is like it's not like these people are getting notices. They're like, hey, we have decided to reduce the federal government and we have decided to get rid of parts of different agencies that we don't need. And so in 30 days, you won't be needed anymore, and here's severance. And then it gives the agency time to make sure, oh, was that person providing critical services? If so, we got to have someone else cover that. And no. It's like middle of the night. One woman said that she's pregnant, she's 6 months pregnant, and she was 1 month away from leaving her probationary period. By the way, all these firings were probationary employees, and what that means is if you've only been a federal employee for a year, you don't have the same civil service protections that others have. So they went after the probationary employees first. That's 10% of the federal workforce. Now, you might think, okay, well, that's just someone who's new anyway, so maybe they didn't have a big job. Some of the probationary employees are probationary because they moved from another job within the federal government. So some of these people are extremely senior and have been there a long time, but just because they moved. But of course, Trump and Elon, they don't know any of that, right? So this woman is 6 months pregnant and was 1 month away from having civil service protections. And at 12:30 in the morning, she was just alerted that she wouldn't be working at the FAA anymore, where she was helping protect our safety.
Doge first, ask questions later. They also talk about government employees like they're subhuman.
Yes. Well,
and it's really...
Russ Vought said in that video that he wants to make them feel traumatized when they come to work. And that is what they're doing. Like they did this. It is not about fucking government efficiency. And I'm like, I am done doing the throat clearing at the beginning. No. That's like, we all want an efficient government and that's what people want. Because it's not that. Like, I know the White House has a clip of us, a
profoundly misleading
misleading clip of us talking about government efficiency, but they didn't include the part where we were saying that this is not government
illegal
efficiency.
And unconstitutional. No, everyone just pause and think about what it means long term when you make every U.S. government job miserable and no one wants to do it and they hate working there. You're going to get bad people to provide crucial services, and we're just losing decades, centuries of expertise and experience in complicated matters. And it's just to say it's all bureaucracy and efficiency and doging is so stupid and simple.
A couple more examples before we move on, because it's making me so angry. They laid off energy department staff who handled homeowners' electricity bills, so there's no one to take the money that keeps people's lights on. The FDA. A lot of food. You like your food inspected for safety? Well, a lot of cuts at the FDA. Women are being turned away from domestic violence shelters in West Virginia because they're all full, and they've had to close those down because the funding freeze that was supposed to be unfrozen in practice really wasn't unfrozen. Yeah. All but 2 employees in one state who headed up an agriculture program that was assisting poor rural communities. These are all Trump voters that are getting cut now. And then the reason you know that it's not about government efficiency or like making government smart or whatever, the IRS cuts, and we're going to talk more about the IRS in a second, but Joe Biden, hired all these extra IRS agents because all these rich tax cheats were getting away with not paying their taxes, and the IRS didn't have enough staff to do it, so they did it. They started collecting billions more in revenue from rich people who were trying to cheat on their taxes, and they are laying all these people off, right? The amount of money it costs to hire the IRS agents is paid for 5 times over by the revenue they're collecting from the rich tax cheats.
Yeah.
So it has nothing to do with efficiency.
No.
In addition to the mass firings, the Dogebags also keep trying to gain access to government systems and databases so sensitive that only a small number of career civil servants have ever been allowed to handle them. We saw this play out at Treasury. Now it's playing out at the IRS, where Gavin Kleiger, who is the Doge guy who's retweeted white nationalist Nick Fuentes, is apparently about to get access to a system called the Integrated Data Retrieval System, or IDRS, which includes all of our tax returns and bank account information. It is so sensitive that even IRS commissioners, the people who run the IRS, haven't been able to access the IDRS. It's apparently this initiative, which is being laid out in a memorandum of understanding that isn't finalized yet, rests with just 2 people, a Doge employee, which appears to be Kleiger, and an IRS employee. What is the administration saying is the justification for this?
I mean, they're saying waste, fraud, and abuse have been deeply entrenched in our broken system for far too long. It takes direct access to the system to identify and fix it. So does this mean that this one dude is going to be like inspector of the entire country's tax information and go through all our personal stuff and compare it to other records and I guess somehow find waste, fraud, and abuse that they will then highlight, and I'm sure a very fair, honest way? Is that what's happening here? Because what is one person going to do with all this access?
I mean, and again, just like the Justice Department, we've talked about Kash Patel, the FBI, the Justice Department. One way they can get revenge on people they don't like is, of course, criminal investigations.
And the IRS is how I do it.
IRS is another big one, right? And it has been used in the past in our country to go after people. So now we're giving this random fucking guy who likes Nick Fuentes access to all of our bank information and our private tax returns.
Well, and also we just know Elon Musk has just been tweeting lie after lie, misleading information. He's pretending like, the Doge people are finding all sorts of line items and government spending that seems silly when it's all just been sitting on a public website.
Yes.
They're just mining public data and using it to further their Doge agenda, which is not about transparency or efficiency. It's about just destroying the U.S. government.
Democrats are trying to make noise about this. Congressman Jimmy Gomez, who sits on Ways and Means, called it a 5-alarm warning. Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden wrote a sternly worded letter to the acting IRS commissioner about it. How do you feel about this? Like, are the tweets and letters enough? I appreciate them. I'm glad that they are fighting, but doesn't it? And I know I have said that Democrats have limited power. We do. That's just the reality of the situation right now. But it does feel like we should be making more noise.
Yeah, I don't know what the tactic is, but I do think this area is eye-catching and scary. I mean, personal tax information. Why does this goober need to have that? Why does this little, white nationalist loving Doge employee need to know my bank account and routing number? I think that's very scary. I think it's also, you can tell a broader story about firing all these IRS people that are just there to audit the richest people in the country and make them pay their taxes. So I'd really lean into this one because I think it will land in a way that I wish this weren't the case, but like talking about USAID cuts just does not.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we've said this and we've seen this throughout history. When there's a government shutdown and government services are cut off, people get mad. And it's always true that the party responsible for the shutdown ends up getting blamed by the public. And stories about the national parks and food safety and all this other kind of stuff like that resonates with people.
Right.
And I do think lifting up the stories of both the workers and the services that are cut and the benefits that could be cut and the safety and security that's being put in jeopardy, like that should be like the top priority for Democrats. And they should be telling the stories everywhere they can, on every medium they can, on every show they can, go on Fox, go on anywhere, like, hold events with some of the people who've been affected by the cuts in services, some of the people who've lost their jobs. People are losing their jobs in the federal government who, and the excuse is you've had poor performance. And they're like, what do you mean I had poor performance? This is my first day on the job. Right. And you just cut it. And then some people had excellent performance reports and they've been told that they have poor. I mean, like, there's just
lying.
no rhyme or reason to
They're
any
just
of this.
making it up. They're just firing people. Remember when it was a national story that the Obama administration suspended White House tours?
Yes.
During a big budget fight? Like, you can make people care about this stuff.
Yeah, I just think that they, I don't know. I don't know if it's the tone. I don't know if it's the style, but like they really just got to be out there and be louder.
Be louder, maybe. Like, look, the protest and attempt to enter the USAID building was, I think, a good idea. Maybe run it back at the IRS.
Yeah.
Just do the execution a little better.
Yeah, it's time to get a little creative, I think. All right, one more purge we should talk about. This one happening at the Department of Justice. So obviously they were trying to purge DOJ prosecutors who were involved in some way in January 6th, the January 6th prosecutions. But now we got a whole nother scandal here. It's just got kicked up a notch thanks to the case against New York Mayor Eric Adams. As you all probably know, last fall, Adams was charged with taking millions of dollars in bribes and illegal campaign donations from the Turkish government in exchange for allowing a Manhattan skyscraper to open without a fire inspection. Trump said at the time that he thought Adams was getting a raw deal because of his views on immigration. Adams then attended the inauguration and met with Trump. On Monday of last week, Emil Bove, the acting deputy attorney general, who you may remember as Trump's defense attorney in the hush money case, ordered federal prosecutors in Manhattan to drop Adams' case based on the argument that his bribery trial would interfere with his efforts to help carry out Trump's mass deportations in New York. The prosecutors refused, and on Wednesday, the acting U.S. attorney at SDNY, a Trump appointee who clerked for Antonin Scalia, resigned. A number of her colleagues then resigned as well, including the lead prosecutor on the case, who wrote in his resignation letter that the move was an illegal effort to influence Adams and, quote, I expect you will eventually find someone who is enough of a fool or enough of a coward to file your motion, but it was never going to be me. On Friday night, Bove gathered the attorneys from DOJ's Public Integrity Unit and gave them 1 hour to figure out who would sign the dismissal motion or that they would all be fired. Eventually, one senior attorney agreed to do it to spare his colleagues. A few hours before we recorded, 4 of Adams' remaining staffers resigned in protest. And in case the quid pro quo between the Trump administration and Adams wasn't clear, here's a clip of border czar Tom Homan on Fox and Friends sitting next to Adams in a joint interview.
If he doesn't come through, I'll be back in New York City, and we won't be sitting on the couch. I'll be in his office, up his butt, saying, where the hell is the agreement we came to? So,
What a fucking embarrassment. When pressed about this, Homan said he and Adams were talking cop to cop and that the press was making too much of it. What do you think? Would you say it's good for democracy that the President of the United States essentially owns the mayor of our largest city?
It's a real bold move to shake down the DOJ Public Integrity Unit, you know?
I mean that, yeah, and I should have mentioned
chef's kiss.
I should have mentioned that in the prompt, but there's 2 sets of resignations here. There's one at SDNY, the Southern District of New York, and the woman who was running SDNY, she was a Trump appointee. She had just risen to the ranks, to the top of the ranks at SDNY. Again, clerked for Scalia, Federalist Society member. So this isn't some like liberal squish, and the fact that she finally gets a dream job, what I can only assume is a dream job, and then resigns because it's this bad?
Yeah, I think everyone saw this play coming, this pardon coming, because Eric Adams started kissing Trump's ass, flew down to Mar-a-Lago, just made a fool of himself. But the way this was structured, it's so that Trump can essentially rescind the pardon if Adams gets out of line, is brazen even for Trump, I think.
Yeah, well, it's not even technically a pardon, right? It's like it's dismissed without prejudice. They could have gone with the pardon or dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't refile the charges. But obviously the reason they don't want to do that is because if Adams doesn't do what Trump says, they will charge him again.
They'll go back. So now Trump owns the mayor of the largest city in the country. He can say, parrot my talking points, or you're going to jail. Because it sounds like Eric Adams, the DOJ, the U.S. Attorney's Office, they have him dead to rights.
Yep.
You know, they spell out some of their feelings on the evidence in these resignation letters. And I do think it's worth emphasizing, no one is defending this.
Right.
Right?
No.
You have all these conservatives at the U.S. Attorney's Office, at DOJ. Yeah, these resignations for these people could be career-ending. You know, this is like the pinnacle of achievement for them, like being the U.S. attorney. in some of these New York offices is a huge deal. You see huge cases, you try huge cases, and they're walking away from it. And on top of that, I mean, 4 New York City deputy mayors are resigning. That, like, in the short term, that is going to severely impact the management of the biggest city in the country. I mean, there's 8 total deputy mayors. 4 of them are now gone. And this is coming after a wave of disruption and resignations and dysfunction during the investigation of Adams. So it's like a disaster for New York City, like one on top of the other.
Also, and I you would think that the resignation of those 4 deputies to Adams would put more pressure on Governor Kathy Hochul, who, by the way, has the authority to remove Eric Adams.
Yes.
And the fact that she hasn't yet is baffling to me.
Me too. But I mean, it feels like it's going to happen, right? Every Democrat's kind of lined it up.
I mean, and you get all these resignations. Right. I will say, though, when we were just talking about collective action problems and people being afraid to step up, like Danielle Sassoon, who was the prosecutor that was running SDNY that resigned, and then Hagen Scotton. I mean, if that name doesn't sound like a conservative to you, this guy was graduated top of his class, Harvard Law, won 2 Bronze Stars in Iraq, and clerked for not just Roberts but Kavanaugh.
Solid. Yeah,
that's the guy who said, like, you'll find a fool, you'll eventually find someone who's enough of a fool or a coward to file your motion, but it's never going to be me. Like, those 2 stepping up I'd like to see a little more of that from Republicans in Congress who just aren't doing anything, or basically like Ezra Klein had a great column over the weekend. He called them NPCs, non-player characters, the whole Congress. Republicans have just decided, like, no, we're not going to do anything.
They are NPCs, yeah. I mean, Bill Cassidy put out a statement about Tulsi Gabbard's nomination, why he was voting for her. They basically said, Donald Trump nominated her, thus I will vote for her. Just giving up his power. But yeah, this is an area where I agree with you. I'd like to see Republicans doing more, but I think Democrats do have some power here. Like, Hochul should remove Adams.
Yeah.
Hopefully that happens. In the near term, that might mean that Andrew Cuomo's back in our lives, and that's tough from another perspective.
Let's go.
But someone else, right? It's a big city. You guys don't have more people in New York to run for office?
There's a scenario here where this is such an overreach that it weakens Trump, and I think Democrats in New York have to help us get to that point.
Well, you heard, Trump's like, I don't know anything about this. And then Beauvais was trying to walk back the initial. He was like, this isn't a quid pro quo. It's like the original memo says that, he can't stand trial because then he can't help enforce President Trump's immigration policies. I mean, it's like, of course it's a fucking quid pro quo.
It's nonsense. It's an obvious quid pro quo. Can I read you a headline
that
you might like? Jan 6 rioters argue pardons apply to charges including murder plot, child porn. Defendants argue that Trump pardons should absolve them of additional crimes, some discovered during investigations of the Capitol riot. So,
That's right. Donald Trump has let out of jail people who have tried to commit homicide, who were plotted to commit homicide.
He had a kill list.
And sexual predators. Child sexual predators.
One of these guys had a literal kill list.
Coming to a community near you thanks to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to pardon his Jan 6 buddies and the people who, getting caught up with the law with child porn and plotting murders. Those are the kinds of people that Donald Trump is releasing into your communities.
MAGA.
All right. When we get back from the break, you're going to hear Tommy's interview with Stephen A. Smith about why he thinks we're all so wrong and whether he's going to run for president himself. 2 quick things before we do that. If you're an Offline fan, heads up. Starting this week,
nobody's an Offline fan,
you will find new episodes of the show in your feed every Thursday. We're moving to Thursday,
changing,
Tommy.
nice.
Instead of every Sunday, because we have the special Pod Save America every other Sunday now that we're doing the interview.
Right.
And so now we're trying to move Offline to Thursday. That means your parasocial relationship with me and Max just got a new time slot. You can catch new episodes of Offline every Thursday wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. Also a reminder, the best way to support our work is to subscribe to Friends of the Pod. You'll get 25% off new annual subscriptions now through Saturday, February 22nd. If you're a monthly subscriber, upgrading is quick and easy. Just visit crooked.com/friends or subscribe through the Pod Save America Apple feed. You get all kinds of stuff. You get access to the fantastic Discord community of all of our subscribers who are always just talking and debating and leaning on each other, and just a wonderful community of subscribers. You also can listen to ad-free episodes of Pod Save America, which is awesome. You get Dan's Polar Coaster Show, which is fantastic. Terminally Online, which is the funniest show that we do here at Crooked. So check it out, crooked.com/friends.
The funniest show.
When we come back, Stephen A.
Pod Save America is brought to you by Lumen. Did you know that when your metabolism is working properly, you will feel all the benefits in literally every aspect of your life? Lumen
packed with 55 plus whole food ingredients to support brain. Get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults.
My guest today is a commentator on ESPN, the host of the Stephen A. Smith Show, and arguably the greatest sports debater of all time, Stephen A. Smith.
What's going on, man? How you doing? How's everything?
It's good. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm a big fan, have been for a very long time, so this is exciting and fun for me. Let's just get right into it. There's been a lot of chatter about you potentially running for president in 2028, and you've had to kind of tell folks to pump the brakes a bit. If I could briefly sum up what I think your position is, it's that you know the process of running sucks. You don't want to go through it, but if drafted to serve, you would be open to it. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. I don't have any desire to do it. I have no desire to be a politician whatsoever. But if the country was in a bad place and you told me that somehow, some way that I'm favored to win an election and be the president of the United States, I don't think anybody would summarily dismiss that personally, because we all live in this country and we all understand what comes with it. And as much of a headache as it would be, as stressful as it would be, as much of a compromise it could potentially be to my quality of life, make no mistake about it, what kind of quality do we really have if the country sucks? If it's just in a very, very bad place with no reprieve in sight whatsoever. So, again, for me personally, with what I have going on in my life, with how happy I am, with the fact that I'm more interested in remaining a pundit and a commentator rather than a politician, those things still stand. I'm very authentic in saying that. I have no desire to be a politician whatsoever. But my God, if you came to me and said, listen, there is nobody else, and America is clamoring for you, which I sincerely doubt would ever happen. But if that were to happen, would I give it strong consideration? I won't lie. Yes, I would. I would give it strong consideration.
Well, I love that you're talking about politics all the time now, because you are a blunt, candid guy. You tell it how it is. And especially when it comes to the Democratic Party, because we're all trying to figure out what happened, why we lost to Trump a second time. Sometimes I think that Democrats like myself, we're too close to the issue. We overthink shit. We read too many polls and focus groups and miss the big picture. So big picture, in your mind, like, what is the simplest explanation for why Democrats lost?
You forgot about what got you here. Black folks got you here. Hispanics got you here. The working class got you here. The most egregious thing that you could say about the Democratic Party right now is that the Republican Party seems to be more identifiable with the working class than the Democrats. Who would have ever thought in our wildest dreams that anybody would be able to get away with saying that? Remember, a lot of times, people that are in the know, that are highly, highly knowledgeable about the intricacies that involve politics, they lean on that. They keep forgetting the voters don't know what they know. The voters live on perception. Whatever issue touches them is what touches them. And that decides who they're going to vote for or whether they'll vote at all. And a lot of people don't get that. I laugh when folks try to challenge my knowledge of the intricacies of politics. I'm like, you're clearly not listening. I tell you all the time, I don't study it like that. I read the newspaper. I watch the news. I'm a conscientious observer, but I'm not entrenched in it the way somebody that lives it every day would be. But I'm an American citizen and I'm a voter. And I'm watching what's going on in the streets of America. And I'm telling you, certain things ain't going to work. When you looked at the Democratic Party, certainly there's probably policies that they've pushed forth and battles that they have fought that would have benefited working class Americans. But that ain't what they were talking about. They were talking about LGBTQ. They were talking about transgender rights specifically. They were acting as if there was no problem at the borders involving illegal immigration. Nobody was believing that. Because if you travel, if you see footage of the streets of America, you're like, what's going on? It wasn't just Fox News, it was everybody. ABC, NBC, CBS. Everybody was talking about the border. When there was crimes in the streets and people were being let out the same day that they were getting arrested. But everybody was talking about that. When you had stores that were allowing 3 people in it at a time because they were afraid they were going to get robbed and the repercussions weren't severe enough. So there was a level of fearlessness that the lawless in our communities were, that they possessed. People were talking about that. And the Democrats were talking about something else. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, you just say to yourself, they really, really forgot. They forgot what got them here, what made them so popular, what got Clinton in office, what got Barack Obama in office. Hell, to some degree, what got Jimmy Carter in office before Reagan arrived. They forgot all of these things. And to forget that against Donald Trump, of all people, who's claiming elections are rigged, who's calling y'all crooks, who's saying that y'all are nasty, evil people, questioning how duplicitous you can be, how corrupt you can be, even while he's getting impeached, even while he's being convicted of felonies, all of this stuff. And y'all just ignored it. Not you. I'm not talking about you, Tommy, but I'm just saying the Democratic Party.
I hear you.
It boggled the mind. It boggled the mind. It still
Boggle.
I feel like there's two parts to the criticism. Part of it I agree with, which is there were some issues like the border where it wasn't just Republicans talking about concerns. It was a broader set of voters, and Democrats tried to be like, oh, that's a distraction. Actually, we should be talking about this thing, and didn't speak to those fears. I think Joe Biden got there late when he did what he supported this bipartisan bill in the Senate that got killed by Trump, and then did a bunch of executive orders to try to shut down the border. But he got there late and people were pissed, and it didn't change the perception. But the other half of this, I think, is that Donald Trump captures attention and keeps it on himself in a way that no other precedent in history has, for better or for worse. And I think this is where I wanted your advice, because you're someone, you are incredible at crafting a narrative, making news, breaking through on social media. You've created your own like sports media empire at a time when people were like, oh, you can't leave ESPN or like do something on your own, right? Because it's all about the mothership. What advice do you have for Democrats about how to get heard and reach people in this digital age?
Get Trump-like. What I mean by that, Tom, is be your real, true, authentic self. For better or worse, can you genuinely tell me, as a person who covers this stuff for a living, that Trump surprises you? What?
No.
Think about how he acts. Think about the things that he says. And then he goes and he tries to do it. For better or worse, he's letting you know, I don't care. I'm not a politician. I'm not a career politician. Listen, the man doesn't even want to be in the White House. Every chance he gets, he's at Mar-a-Lago. He doesn't even want to be there. Okay, he wants to run the country from his resort, for crying out loud. He might want to use the Air Force One plane, okay, so he don't have to spend his own money with his gas and everything else. But he'd rather, but that's about it. The man wants to be where he wants to be. He wants to do what he wants to do. He wants to show you every chance he gets that he is nothing like the career politicians. He is nothing like what you have witnessed for decades on Capitol Hill. He says Capitol Hill needs to be purged. What is he doing? He's trying to purge Capitol Hill. You understand? Meanwhile, we had Kamala Harris, Miss Prim and Proper, tries to say the right things, listening to her party, talk to her about this is the way to go over the last 107 days to win an election, etc. And guess what? It wasn't resonating. You go on The View, and The View says, is there anything at all about Joe Biden that you would do differently, that you would change?
Yeah.
And she looked into the cameras and said, I can't think of any. What?
Yeah.
What? I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, you can't do that, because it's not just about your answer. It's about the believability factor. You see, even when Trump is lying, you believe that he believes what he's saying and what he says he's going to do. Even if he's lying to himself, you sit up there, you look it up, look, man, you can't just eradicate departments like that. You can't just violate civil liberties. Like, you can't just sit up there and make your own rules and subvert the Constitution and try to get a third term in office, whatever. But who doubts he's going to try? Who doubts that he's going to try to pull that off? Whatever it is that he says, there is an authenticity that comes with it in terms of how it resonates to the American people who are salty and skeptical with vile feelings towards Capitol Hill. That's where the connection happens. Well, if you are somebody on the Democratic side and you feel that way, where's your vitriol? Where's your disgust? Where's your aversion to the status quo and what you aim to do about it? That's what people want to see.
And you're right. I mean, his message is burn it all down, and he somehow gets a pass for having been in charge for 4 years when all the problems he's complaining about now still existed. But Democrats were boring. We're the NBA skills competition where Wemby's cheating, while Trump is the USA-Canada hockey game where there's 3 fights in 10 seconds and you can't look away. And like I don't know how to compete with that. We don't have a leader who can compete with that. We don't have a party that can compete with that. We don't have a message that can compete with that.
But tell why. You can't compete with that, and you don't have that. I'm not talking about you specifically, of course.
I know.
About the Democratic Party. You don't know that, and you can't compete with that for the biggest reason of all. Because y'all are too busy trying to pick candidates for the American people instead of listening to the American people tell you who they want. The last Democrat that the American people told you they wanted was Barack Obama. Hillary
I thought he was
Clinton,
going to say Bernie.
it's her turn. Bernie Sanders had momentum. It's Hillary's turn. Joe Biden captured momentum because Representative Clyburn got involved in South Carolina, saved his behind, but it's really, really his turn, okay? He has no business running for re-election, but everybody went for it, knowing he was supposed to be transitional. He was going to be 81 years of age. Then you sit up there. He doesn't have a primary. Then he goes on the debate stage, embarrasses himself. Then y'all still let him take 3 damn weeks to walk away instead of getting the hell out there immediately so you can see if there's somebody other than Kamala Harris who could be the Democratic nominee. Then she gets the nomination, and everybody wants to act like she's the rock star all of y'all wanted all along. Oh, my God, let's throw up our hands and just say, hey, she is the one, when you know good and damn well that wasn't the truth. Meanwhile, Trump has been around since 2015. They had Christie, they had Kasich, they had Fiorini, I believe her name is.
Yep, Carly Fiorina.
You had, later on, you had DeSantis, you had Nikki Haley, you had Ramaswamy, you had all of these people. It didn't matter. We went through lawfare and all this stuff. It didn't matter. They looked the public in the face and they said, we want him. We don't care what y'all want. And forced the Republican Party to capitulate to the demands of their constituency. That's what they did. The Democrats somehow, some way, have gotten away with ignoring the constituency and compelling the constituency to capitulate to what they want as a party. And that is the problem. And that's why I said it all needs to go. Some of those candidates need to go. The pundits, the strategists, they need to go. Whoever was involved with the latest election, from a strategy standpoint, every one of them should be fired. Every one of them.
We're cleaning house. I think Joe Biden running for re-election was a catastrophic mistake. We will not recover from it for a long time, and I completely agree with you there. But I want your thoughts on this. Donald Trump is using sports in a really smart way politically. I think he went to college football games and UFC fights during the campaign. He went to the Super Bowl. He did a loop around the track of the Daytona 500 in his limo over the weekend. It feels like he's creating a bond with these audiences that Democrats don't have. And how do you think Democrats can be a part of that conversation? I can't think of anyone who would go to a game, like, except for Barack Obama going to NBA games because he genuinely loved the sport. But like, who else?
This is why I'm a candidate. I don't want to be, and that's why I am one. Because you see, I wouldn't go to the Daytona 500, but I'd have been at the Super Bowl. I'd have been at the Hockey All-Star Game. I'd have been at NBA All-Star Weekend. I'd be at the World Series. I'd be at All-Star Weekend for baseball. I mean, the list goes. I'd be at a boxing match. I'd be at a UFC match, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, you're a politician. You're supposed to be able to do what the people want you to do as a politician. See, this is just, you're giving me damning evidence I didn't even think about. I didn't think about it until you brought it up. I'm going like this, wait a minute. Aren't they politicians? Isn't it their job to recognize and notice what their constituency finds appealing and cater to that?
But let me tell you, if Obama went to the Super Bowl, Fox News would be like, how dare he? This cost $10 million. He put Secret Service there. Like, they would go after him.
Nope, that doesn't work. Here's why.
You don't think so?
Because Obama's not looking for their vote. He knows he's not getting it. You're talking about the other side. And
damn, he's got a good point.
And the independents wants, here's what the independents wants, because I'm a registered independent. I'm not a Democrat. I'm a registered, I'll vote for a Republican in a heartbeat. I might not have voted for Trump, But I'm not averse to all conservative policies. I have some conservative policies I support. I have a lot of liberal policies I support. But let me
Right.
be
You don't like
very
taxes.
Say what?
You don't like taxes.
That's right. I don't like high taxes. I don't like high taxes. I don't like open borders. I don't like open borders. I think that those kind of things affect the economy in a negative kind of way, no matter how we try to slice it. Look at Mayor Eric Adams in New York City complaining about the billions of dollars it cost him and what it's deprived him of in terms of what he has to contribute to the system in terms of homelessness and other issues that are permeating in the city of New York City. Because why? He had to spend money on the illegal immigration issue, it being a sanctuary city. So all of those things come into play. But the point that I'm trying to make is this. If you're around, if you're looking at somebody and you're saying to yourself, what is it going to take? How can we find that candidate? The first order of business is finding a candidate that recognizes the importance of appealing to not only his own constituency, but those who are undecided and playing to win. If you're a centrist, what you're saying is, I'm willing to compromise. I'm willing to walk across the aisle and work with people. I'm not interested in all of this chaos. If it has to get chaotic, so be it. But that's not the objective. That's not the goal. We're Americans. We can come together. We can work together. Don't look at black, white, Latino, Asian, whatever the case may be. Don't look at all of that stuff and think that that's a license to dismiss and alienate others just because they don't look nor feel like you do. You might have a shot at convincing them if you talk to them. You could go to them and talk to them about what their desires are, what they wish for their communities, what's the kind of things that plagues their community and how we can alleviate those concerns. That's your responsibility. And see, to me, I'm sitting there again. I have no desire to be in politics. Zero. My life is pretty good. My life is pretty damn good. But guess what? I'm looking at it and I'm saying, this isn't hard. This isn't hard. I'm talking about compared to the Democratic candidates that you have available. It's not hard.
Who do you like?
Look at their roster.
Who do you like? You like Wes Moore, Josh Shapiro? You talked to them both recently, right? Like who's on your top five?
Listen, I was very impressed with Josh Shapiro. Very impressed with him. And I love me some Wes Moore. No doubt about it, right? And if there's anybody, but I would be concerned. I think that one could easily argue Trump would never have been president if Barack Obama hadn't been president. That Barack Obama's presidency caused a white backlash, okay? Because you had people in this country that didn't like his policies, didn't like him, was walking around crying about how he's trying to indoctrinate our children just because he was speaking to elementary school kids and stuff. Just ridiculous stuff that people came up with, right? Which was far beyond the pale, no excuse for, okay? But people were really feeling like their way of life was being compromised because, again, they didn't know everything that he was doing. They were going by what they were being told by the other side. And then here comes Trump saying, we're going to purge this whole system. We're going to throw this all aside because these folks ain't strong enough, ain't good enough. Remember, Jeb Bush, low energy, Marco Rubio, small hands and all of this other stuff, little Marco and stuff like that. Carla Fiorini and, she's this or that, or Doug Chris Christie and getting on him. We saw Kasich. I was a huge fan of Kasich. But guess what? He wasn't resonating with the constituency out there. So their side chose who their side chose. You don't get an opportunity to do that as Democrats because they pick who they want exposed. Instead of saying, let's put everybody out there and see who the constituency gravitates towards. That's the problem. And that's the real reason why somebody like little old me is polling, which makes no damn sense whatsoever. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing.
It makes sense to me. I like it. I think it's good.
Embarrassing to the Democratic Party. It really.
Listen, I hear on one level, sure, but also I think I'm with you. I think primaries are good, and I think the rubber meets the road in primaries, and that you could do polling all you want, but until you actually ask people to vote for someone, then you don't really know who they support. But let me talk about Trump's actions so far. I mean, I saw you say Elon Musk is a problem. Do you think Trump is overreaching? Is he doing things that might offend those moderates, or are those moderates just not even hearing about the details and they're just hearing like, oh, he's out there doing shit?
Of course he's overreaching. But why is he overreaching? Because he has the license and the mandate to do so. Because you see on the left, you've got Democrats saying there's no mandate. He didn't receive 50% of the vote. Are you kidding me? He won 49.8% of the vote. He had over 77 million people vote for him. He beat you by nearly 3 million votes if you're the Democratic Party. He beat you by over 3 million, nearly 3 million votes. Okay? He won every swing state. He went up in 50 different counties across the country. Didn't drop in any of them. And oh, by the way, the black vote, the Latino vote, and the young vote, he basically got an increase in that regard. You look at all of those different things. In a blue state like New York City, that in 2016, I think it was Hillary, she got like 62% of the vote in New York City. It was like 53% for Biden. It was 37% in this particular situation for Trump. He got 37%. What are you talking about? You're listening to these people and you're saying, Trump, there's no mandate. No, he does have a mandate. And because he has that, he's pushing the envelope. And why is he pushing the envelope? Because he knows something that Democrats better pick up on. Democrats are strongest usually during the national election. During those midterms, most of the time Republicans are seen as going to the polls more so than Democrats. If Trump can somehow, some way win the midterms, he'll be able to do whatever the hell he wants because they'll get even more seats
it's like people-sized
in the Senate
here,
and the House come midterm elections.
Such a tiny head.
He sees this. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he's pushing the envelope because he knows he has the Republicans scared shitless to go against him. So as a result, do whatever I want to do right now. I think this is going to win me additional seats for the party in the midterms, which is why he was talking about Gavin Newsom the way that he was talking about Gavin Newsom, because for the first time in a while, they sense they can take California. They can shift. They can turn it into, if not red, turn it into at least a purple state. You understand? Do something.
Yep.
He's sensing all of this, and he sees an opportunity, and that's what's going on. So I'm not surprised by what he's doing at all. It's perfectly understandable, and most people in that position of power, if they have an agenda, they will go to whatever extent necessary to do that. Remember, Barack Obama I think it was 2012, he sat up there and said the American people, not just 2008, 2012 too, said the American people have spoken. They elected us.
Right.
And oh, by the way, we don't need Congress to get everything we want done. Barack Obama said that in 2012. How do I know that? Because Trump has sent his surrogates out to remind everybody what Obama said back in 2012, just to use it.
You're right. I mean, well, the reason he said that, though, look, you're making a lot of points I agree with. I actually think Democrats have done better more recently in the midterms, and I have confidence that we can, because we're now the nerds that read the newspaper, and we're highly informed, and we knock on doors, and we go out and we vote in midterms, whereas sort of the broader electorate that Trump brings in, which is why he kicks our ass in these presidential elections, they're more sporadic voters. But to your point about the mandate, like, of course he has a mandate. He won the election. He won by a bigger margin than he did last time. Of course he has a mandate. I think that doesn't give you a mandate to do everything you want to do, because Obama won in 2008 with 52.9% of the vote and 365 electoral votes, and Republicans tried to block literally everything he did. So I do think there's space between, yes, Trump has a mandate, but the suggestion you see sometimes that Democrats shouldn't be fighting back, or that we're the problem for fighting back, or that it's the wrong optics or messaging, if you know what I'm saying.
What I would say to you is that you're wrong. And the reason you're wrong is because never before has the Democratic Party been this damaged. This is bad, bro.
2004 was bad. We got our asses handed to us by Bush. Lost seats in Congress.
But listen, John Kerry wasn't that strong. You know what I mean? He didn't necessarily appeal that much. This was different because the reason why it's never been this bad, George W. Bush, for whatever it is that you want to say, the Republicans didn't really have that much of a problem with him. And if you look at America at that particular moment, we might not want it to be in the war in Iraq. We might not want to be chasing around Osama bin Laden and all of that stuff. That might be true. But in the end, it wasn't like it is now. How it is now is there's a president that was convicted on 34 felony counts and impeached twice. Back in the day, this man wouldn't have even been allowed to run for office. How do we know that to be true? Let's take into account the whole hush money trial in New York. According to the courts and according to what we've seen, Donald Trump hooked up with a porn star. Donald Trump didn't want that get out before the election. So he paid some hush money to silence her. That's it. And he was scared for that to be found out. Think about that. That is what he was scared about before 2016. Now, he gets convicted of 34 felony counts after being impeached twice, and he has no fear running for re-election. In that short period of time, look at how things have changed. It's not the same. The Democratic Party's got to wake up. It has changed drastically. You know, somebody said to me, I joked around because I've been single all my life, and I said, look, man, I don't need to be running for no damn office. I've been single all my life. I've been doing some things in my lifetime. Okay, I don't need to do that. And somebody said to me, quote, please, after Donald Trump, who cares? What did Al Sharpton just say? What did Al Sharpton just say about Andrew Cuomo running for the mayor's seat in New York? He said everything's changed because Donald Trump got reelected. He said the bar is so low, I don't even know if we can find it. The point that I'm trying to make to you is that you're dealing with a different beast. You're dealing with a different time. This is not politics as usual. And let me tell the Democratic Party something else, because I hope you're not one of these people. I hope you're not one of those people out there wasting your time knocking on doors. I hope you're not doing that. Because they're working.
Whoa. Yes, I am. Knocking on doors is good during midterms, Stephen A.
No, here's what I mean. Stop wasting your
I
time.
personally knocked on doors. It was great. I had good conversations. I got people to give me their ballots. We delivered them.
Listen to what I'm saying to you. If they voted for you, they were going to vote for you anyway. If they didn't vote for you, they weren't going to vote for you anyway.
That's not true. I had conversations with people who were not going to vote unless I was there at their door getting them.
I don't give a damn what they told you. I'm telling you right now, because the media and the platforms that we have available to us now, podcasting, YouTube shows, linear television, cable, streaming, there are too many outlets to watch that influence your thinking. Don't waste your time knocking on doors. Don't do it. Stop.
Get out there, make some content. Well, listen, Stephen A., this was a lot of tough love for our audience who doesn't always hear it. I really appreciate this. It was fun and entertaining and good to talk to you. And I think we need to emulate some of this in the Democratic Party. We need you guys in sports radio talk about the GOAT debate, like MJ versus LeBron. We need our own version of that, like Lincoln, Washington, Obama, Reagan. Maybe you can help me workshop this. We get something fun, make this interesting, make this more accessible to people. But I'm very grateful you came on.
Let me end it by saying this to you. Covering sports, you can have great players, right? Why would the owner not be satisfied? Because they're always looking for somebody box office. Winning is one thing that's very, very important because obviously you win during the regular season, you win through the playoffs, you play more games, you generate more revenue because you have more games to play. But nothing beats somebody who's a box office attraction because folks walk through the turnstiles if for no other reason to see him. And what I'm saying to you is, I'm not talking about a bunch of manufactured audiences like you had at the DNC in Chicago. That's not what I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about somebody that Obama was, for example, in 2008, where ultimately he elevated to rock star status, where no matter where he went or what he had to say, the camera was a magnet for him. And then obviously you got to follow through with the message and you got to follow through with practice. All of that's true. But you got to get somebody with sizzle. You got to get somebody that when they speak, they influence minds. They influence hearts. And they get people to really, really think and spin their wheels. I'm talking about not people on the left because you got them. I'm talking about the independents. I'm talking about the centrists. You got to get somebody that can speak to that audience, that can go across the aisle and dare Republican constituency to bet against them because guess what? I'm better than the candidate that you have because I'm going to look out for you better than the candidate that you have because that's what Trump was telling a bunch of black folks, Hispanic folks. What do you have to lose and all of this other stuff? This is what Trump did. He was fearless with it. Where are those Democrats? I don't see them around. That's why I'm a damn candidate, because of that. It's embarrassing.
I love it.
I want to make sure America understands this. I believe it is an utter embarrassment to the Democratic Party that I am a candidate in people's eyes for the presidency of the United States. It's an indictment against them, and they need to get their act together before somebody like me or somebody else takes it real seriously and says the hell with y'all, because the roster that I'm seeing right now, y'all don't have anything. You don't have anything that's going to sizzle with the national audience. I love Wes Moore, and I love Josh Shapiro. I think both of them got a chance, all right? But I need somebody that was national appeal, and maybe it is one of them. I hope so. I really do, because the Democratic Party is in a bad state right now. The whole damn thing needs to be purged. I'm dead serious. They need to go. Those strategists, fire every damn one of them. Get rid of them. Get rid of them. They serve no purpose. Find somebody else.
It's good. It's good, tough love. We got to step up. Stephen A., thank you so much for doing the show. I really appreciate it.
All right, man. Take care.
That's our show for today. Thanks so much to Stephen A. for coming on. Dan and I will be back with a new show on Friday. Talk to everybody then.
This video is brought to you by Ground News. The EU has had a bumpy weekend. Vice President JD Vance used his speech at the Munich Security Conference to attack what he called Europe's threat from within. Trump announced that Saudi Arabia would be hosting bilateral negotiations between the US and Russia without Ukraine or Europe, and the US reiterated that Ukraine's post-war security would be Europe's responsibility. In this context, on Saturday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for, quote, an army of Europe, and on Monday, EU Council President Antonio Costa told the Financial Times the EU needs, quote, a new security architecture ahead of an emergency meeting of EU leaders in Paris. So in this video, we're going to take yet another look at the history behind the idea of a European army, and whether it could actually happen this time. Don't feel overwhelmed by endless news stories. Find out what you need to know every day with TLDR's Daily Briefing. Listen along in your favourite podcast app or by clicking the link in the description. So let's start with some context. Because the idea of a European army, or something to that effect, has a long history. It was first seriously considered in 1952, when the US pushed for West Germany to be rearmed so that it could join NATO. For obvious reasons, France weren't so keen on this, and so instead proposed creating a new European defence community via the Treaty of Paris, which would have combined the armies of all the members of the European coal and steel community, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg, under one supranational command, with the intention of forming a political union in the future. The French Parliament, however, didn't like the idea of giving up national control of their army, refused to ratify the treaty in August 1954, and West Germany ended up joining NATO. France tried to resurrect the idea again in the 1960s, when French President Charles de Gaulle, who really didn't like NATO or the US, tried to transform the European Economic Community into a security alliance of sorts. But he didn't get anywhere, because the other members of the EEC decided they were happy with NATO. This has always been the main obstacle to an independent European security policy, and it's probably the main reason that French President Emmanuel Macron's efforts to get Europe to take security and, quote, strategic autonomy more seriously have largely failed. Why would you create a new European security architecture when you already have NATO, which covers most of Europe and includes the world's biggest military in the US? Nonetheless, pretty significant progress was made towards an independent EU security policy around the turn of the millennium, when French President Jacques Chirac and British Prime Minister Tony Blair signed the St. Malo Declaration in the aftermath of the Yugoslav Wars, which laid the groundwork for the development of the Common Security and Defence Policy, or CSDP. This was followed by a series of agreements setting out a framework for defence cooperation, which included allowing the EU to use NATO assets. The EU then embarked on its first peacekeeping mission in North Macedonia in 2003, and soon deployed European troops in multiple peacekeeping and civilian missions around the world under the CSDP. Although it's worth stressing that the CSDP is just a framework. In other words, it doesn't legally bind EU militaries to do anything, just provides a forum for them to discuss cooperation. But progress towards a European army halted, and then regressed in the mid-2000s for two reasons. First, in 2004, 10 new countries joined the EU, 7 of which were formerly part of the Eastern Bloc, and 3 of which were ex-Soviet countries. In part because these countries were mainly worried about Russia's neo-imperial ambitions and were generally pretty friendly with the US, they overwhelmingly preferred NATO to the idea of an EU army. Second, the Iraq War in 2003 divided France and the UK, and laid bare some of the more fundamental strategic disagreements between the two. This meant that France had to rely on Germany instead of the UK to front any European security policy. But this never really worked, because, well, the German army just isn't strong enough, especially after Merkel's austerity-era cuts. There was then some chatter about it in Trump's first term, mostly led by Macron, but nothing really came of it, both because Trump didn't end up being as NATO skeptic as some commentators worried, and because he was promptly succeeded by Biden. However, the idea has returned to the table in the past few days, after Trump began negotiating a peace deal with Russia without Ukraine's input, and told the Europeans that they would be responsible for guaranteeing Ukraine's security after the war. This would probably require tens, if not hundreds of thousands of European troops, which is why over the weekend, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that, quote, the time has come for an army of Europe to face Russia. While no other European leaders have used quite the same language, on Monday they met in Paris to discuss their response, and EU Council President Antonio Costa told the Financial Times the EU needs, quote, a new security architecture. So, could some sort of European army actually happen? Well, there are reasons to be sceptical. Most obviously, the creation of a European army, at least if it were to happen under the auspices of the EU, would require unanimity from European leaders, which feels very unlikely. Poland's foreign minister has already come out to say that Poland would veto any moves towards an EU army, insisting that, quote, it will not happen, and it's hard to see even more Eurosceptic leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary agreeing to this sort of thing. It's also worth saying that the EU has a lot on its plate at the moment, with various outstanding disagreements over issues like debt, and it's not clear it has the bureaucratic bandwidth to sort out another new treaty and create an entirely new army. Nonetheless, there are at least 3 reasons to think the idea of some sort of European army is more likely than you might think. First, what looks like the death of NATO. As we mentioned earlier, NATO has always been the main obstacle to an independent European security policy. Europeans preferred to lean on America's massive military might, and there was a sense that a new European security policy would just duplicate what Europe already has with NATO, and possibly even interfere with or undermine the alliance. However, NATO does look pretty defunct at the moment. The Americans have been pivoting away from Europe towards China and the Indo-Pacific since at least the Obama administration, and NATO's apparent reinvigoration under Biden now looks like a fleeting interruption to this trend rather than a reversal. Second, it's a surprisingly popular idea. In April 2022, a couple of months after Putin's invasion, YouGov ran an international poll asking Europeans if they'd support the creation of a, quote, integrated European army. In every country apart from the UK, more respondents supported the idea than opposed it, and the percentage of Europeans supporting the idea had risen markedly compared to 2021. And third, it might be surprisingly cost-effective. European countries, many of which are already struggling with unsustainable debt burdens, are struggling to increase their defence budgets. Coordinating and combining spending via some sorts of joint European effort would be more cost-effective, both because Europe would be buying in bulk and because this would force all European militaries to buy the same systems, which could be more easily combined, allowing for the same firepower on a lower budget. This would become even more tempting if the EU decided to fund this via further joint borrowing, which is something both EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas and Macron have suggested, and something we talked a fair bit about in a previous video. All in all, while a full-on European army does still feel unlikely in the near future, deeper cooperation between national militaries and on issues like procurement seems inevitable, and who knows where it'll ultimately lead, especially following the fallout of this weekend's Munich Security Conference. But actually following along with news like this is pretty difficult in the current landscape. We're increasingly being flooded by misleading content, algorithmic feeds that just back up our biases, and reductions in fact-checking efforts. It almost feels like people are intentionally making it harder to get to the truth. One way you can cut through the noise is with Ground News, a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. Every story...
Where to begin? I mean, on the one hand, you have a quid pro quo between a sitting criminal president and the criminal mayor of the biggest city in the country that is so blatantly corrupt, it's resulted in even more resignations from people who are thankfully unwilling to participate in this scheme. On the other hand, you have the world's richest man, a demonstrably terrible person who couldn't be trusted with the data of Twitter users, accessing the data of large swaths of the United States government. A man who has now set his sights on your personal finances and the personal finances of every person in this country. So, throw that on top of the pile of accessing health data, including Medicare and Medicaid, getting his hands on USAID, the Department of Education, the country's payroll department, our nuclear arsenal, our Federal Emergency and Disaster Response Department, our weather data, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and who could forget the FAA? The agency tasked with keeping our planes right side up. And yeah, I'd say we should probably start there, unfortunately, because as annoying as talking about Elon Musk is, living under his rule is much, much worse. So the best we can do is continue to make people aware of what he and his team of gooners are up to and what they're up to next. And that is getting their hands on your complete financial profile.
I feel so efficient.
Are you feeling more efficient, folks? Because if you're not, Musk can pretty much just type in your name and figure out where the pain points are.
Sweet. So Musk and his team of little boys have targeted the IRS. Now I know what you're thinking. Boo! Taxes! Boo! Everyone hates taxes.
It's true.
Who cares what Doge does to the IRS? I say good riddance. Well, buddy, just like with everything else, this is absolutely not going to benefit you or anyone you care about, and will only benefit the absolute richest members of society, while making sure that you continue paying more than your fair share. For context, the IRS being underfunded was done intentionally, because going after the biggest tax cheats requires a ton of investigative and legal work, so it costs a ton of money. The Biden administration, despite its faults, allocated $60 billion worth of funding for the IRS so that it could finally go after the millionaires and billionaires that haven't been paying their fair share, as the act specifically targeted people making over $400,000 per year. We said it back when this was proposed and enacted, but this is another example of funding where the return is far greater than the cost.
Yeah.
And it's an actual example of making things more efficient because it pays for itself, and then some. A study released a few weeks back from Clemson University already showed progress with the increased IRS funding through Biden's Inflation Reduction Act.
The Internal Revenue Service has ramped up its efforts to recover unpaid taxes from millionaires. It collected more than $1.1 billion from 1,600 wealthy Americans with known but unpaid tax debts in the 2024 fiscal year, up from just $38 million a year earlier.
That's quite the increase.
Yeah. With 1,600 Americans who were clearly not paying their fair share, and they were just like, okay, well, time to cough it up. And that massive increase came from that small amount of people.
But what if they were going to use that money they stole from the government to create jobs?
Well, they go into further details about precisely who was being targeted by this increased funding, and they reiterate that the audit rate for anyone making under $400,000 a year has remained unchanged at 0.3% of likelihood. So, extremely wealthy people using loopholes, workarounds, or shrewd legal maneuvers make things more expensive and difficult for everyone else. So actually funding a department to simply go after what is owed seems like a pretty good thing that a majority of Americans would get behind, since a majority of Americans do not make $400,000 a year, but do pay a significant amount in taxes.
Now, hold on. I plan on making $400,000 a year at some point.
Yes,
and when I do, this is going to piss me off quite a lot.
Yes, the standard American who is typically or temporarily just
I'm only temporarily embarrassed.
Yeah.
One day, I will no longer be embarrassed. I will take my seat rightfully in that tax bracket, and this is going to really fuck up my shit.
Yeah, every American thinks that they are going to be a billionaire eventually. But yes, this program was already successful, once again from that Clemson report. The IRS used part of its new funding to triple the audit rates on large corporations and increase audits on partnerships with more than $10 million in assets. Overall, with the additional funding, the IRS made remarkable progress in the 2024 fiscal year, securing nearly $100 billion through its audits of filed tax returns. Notably, the IRS spent only 34 cents for every $100 collected through audits.
Seems pretty efficient.
Yeah.
All that is to say, though, the program not only paid for itself by going
I guess it was
after
last week at
wealthy
this
tax
point.
cheats, it actually brought in additional revenue that could, and should have been in the first place, used to fund other aspects of the government, including infrastructure, education, healthcare, transportation, etc. It's easier to work on big, beneficial projects when the richest people from the richest country actually pay back into the country that allowed them the opportunity to amass such wealth.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Don't care about any of this.
Could we be on the verge of Ukraine peace talks? And just what could it all mean? As American and Russian negotiators meet in Saudi Arabia to discuss the possible start of negotiations to end the 3-year war, here are some of your questions about what it all means and what could come next. Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict, security,
I literally just
and
had you out.
statehood.
You want to
So,
be played with
Stuart
again?
Hall 3874 asks, what does victory look like for Ukraine? And likewise, what does victory look like for Russia? So, Stuart, thank you very much for this, because I think this in many ways really does raise
imagine being
a
named after a
fundamental
mouse.
question about where these talks are going to go, if in fact they do start. Because I think the positions of the sides are quite clearly very, very different from each other. I mean, all right, that's something you could say is in the case of any conflict, but I think in this one, for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, it's even more significant. So, I mean, we clearly know what the position of the two parties, the fundamental starting position of the two parties would be. So Ukraine's position would be a return of all territory that is under Russian occupation, including Crimea, and its right to choose its own future, which includes NATO membership. Now, of course, the Russian position is going to be absolutely diametrically opposed to that. So Russia's position is, well, we have now conquered this territory. As far as we're concerned, we have annexed it. It's our territory. We can't and won't return it. That there should be absolutely no NATO membership for Ukraine. And I think Russia would like to see an end to the current government in Ukraine and a regime that is far more to its liking. But when we talk about peace processes, I mean, in many cases, what we're talking about is what is a realistic meeting point for those positions. My concern in this case is that there isn't a realistic meeting point for the positions, especially on the question of territory, because, as I've said many times, we are now at the possibility that what we will see is, if Russia is allowed to keep the territory that it's invaded and occupied, this will be the most significant and one of the very few examples since 1945 of where a country has invaded, occupied, and annexed territory, and that has been accepted. In actual fact, one would argue that it would be the only case where that has happened in that way. That I can't think of any other where there was such an example of one sovereign state invading the territory of another sovereign state and then annexing that territory and formally saying, well, look, it's ours, and then the international community signing off on it. Now, you could get the argument that if Ukraine was willing to accept that, then that legalizes it, yes, but there's also the position that that would be done under duress, that would not have really been a consensual agreement. And I think it opens up so many difficulties for international relations. But of course, one has to balance that against the fact is that you can say having principles, but there is a conflict in place, and this is a conflict that many now argue that, rightly or wrongly, Ukraine can't win. So what is the outcome that would end the fighting, but wouldn't in actual fact sign off on the dotted line. And it is an incredibly complex set of questions that hopefully I'll touch on in some of the other questions that I'm going to answer. But essentially, what we would really be looking at is, I think, that a full final peace agreement that would accept that Russian annexation is highly unlikely. What we're probably more likely to be talking about, and I know that there will be a lot who will be very unhappy about this, is essentially a ceasefire and a frozen conflict. That what would happen is it would essentially say, right, okay, Russia, you hold this territory. There's not much that Ukraine can do about it at the moment. But the international community is not going to sign off on what is quite clearly an illegal land grab. It becomes complicated because I think that would probably be the better outcome in many people's minds from a European and a Ukrainian perspective. But I'm not sure that that would be the outcome that the United States would be looking for all sorts of reasons. So I think we really are in a very strange position with this conflict as to what we could see as being, you know, to use the terminology, the landing zone of an eventual agreement. And I think this is actually part of the reason why so many people are very skeptical about the way that this process is going to go, because there are these fundamental differences, but there are also fundamental differences which have the potential to upend international relations if allowed to remain in place. So if Russia is allowed to take hold of these territories in Ukraine, then what's to stop it saying, well, thank you very much, we will now formally annex Abkhazia. We will formally annex South Ossetia. Transnistria is a little bit more difficult because it's separated from Russia by Ukraine. But I think it's really very problematic. So I think, when you ask what is victory for the two sides, we know what victory is. It's how do you square that with this peace process? And I think as a lot of observers will be saying, that the direction that the Trump administration has been taking, not just in starting this process without consulting with its allies, without consulting with Ukraine, but also laying out some very clear positions as far as it's concerned. So, for example, J.D. Vance saying, well, Ukraine will have to give up territory, is extremely disturbing on all sorts of levels. So, as I say, I think we know what the sides would view as victory. And as I say, in many cases, you'd be able to then say, right, okay, what's a sensible meeting point? But I think in this case, what we're talking about is so profound for its implications for international relations that I think a lot of countries will rightly be very, very concerned about being seen to sort of come up with a halfway agreement that says to Moscow, yes, all right, you can keep some of this territory. It would have truly profound implications for international relations, which would affect the nature of international security, I think, for the rest of this century. Teacher Talk P7I asks, what are Trump's political and economic objectives and priorities in this negotiation? You really hit on the big question I think we all have in our minds. How exactly does the Trump administration view this process? What is it that they're trying to achieve with these talks? I think there's a whole range of different issues that we have here that are very difficult to unpack. And it's not that there's just one explanation. I think there could be several explanations. I mean, I think one of the factors quite clearly is Trump himself. And I think there's several factors here. I think there's Trump's sense of vanity, that he wants to be the person who has solved this conflict. People have pointed out he deeply resented the fact that Obama was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and frankly, for not really doing very much. And Trump no doubt feels that he is deserving of the prize. So maybe that in one way is driving what he's doing. I think there's also a very clear business element that could be in this. Russia obviously has extreme number of minerals and resources that Trump may feel, look, if we do a peace deal, and this is something that, you can see quite clearly from the way that the Russians are framing this, that they see this as a very much about opening the way for a return to business with the United States. And I suspect that Trump is seeing it in exactly the same way. I think a third factor that comes into this is maybe Trump, who is fixated on China, would say this is potentially the best way to peel Russia off from China. And if in his mind he has to make a calculation of which is the greater enemy to the United States, is it Russia or is it China? Then maybe there are many in the administration who would say, well, in actual fact, it's China. This is the long-term strategic challenger to the United States, the long-term strategic threat to the United States, much more so than Russia. But China needs Russia. It needs that a lot of the Russian minerals. And so maybe the best way of separating out Russia and China, which, and that relationship has become a lot closer because of Ukraine, is to reach a deal and then start to bring Russia back into engaging with the United States and perhaps, dangle before Putin the chance that, look, if you deal with me and we can get that agreement going, then that is going to open the door for other countries. And I think in many ways he's probably right. I don't know whether the Europeans would immediately fall into line, but they would then be potentially left in a very difficult situation if Russia then turns around and says, well, if America then turns around and says, we're going to deal with Russia, you've got a lot of other countries which are happy to deal with Russia, China, India, many African states, they're not going to be held back by this. And so maybe Putin knows this, that if he can do the deal with the United States and leave Europe isolated, then eventually European states will start to falter. Some of the more pro-Russian ones will break ranks with EU partners, refuse to introduce any more sanctions and things. So it'll slowly open his way. So in terms of what I think is behind this, I think it's a complex range of factors. So I think it's partly Trump's own wish to see a settlement because he sees this as a way of burnishing his reputation and his standing in history. I think there is a business agenda here. I think there is an element that he wants to peel Russia away from China. And I think on top of all of this, I don't think there is any great love for Europe and what Europe might be feeling about all of this. So that sense of, why should we care what the Europeans think and if they don't like it? So as I say, I think there's a complex range of reasons behind it. But what I think is very clear is that what we are seeing now from the United States seems to be a divergence, a fundamental divergence from Europe. And the big question that obviously everyone now is really asking is how is Europe going to respond to this, which is, I think, going to be a very, very important challenge that European partners will be facing in all of this, especially if it looks likely that after this first meeting in Riyadh, that there are going to be further meetings, and the United States seems very keen to push ahead with this agenda. So, CC Lilford asks, does America really have the leverage to force a peace deal without Europe's approval? And whatever happened to the coalition of the willing? I think this ties in really closely with the previous point about this divergence that we're seeing between the United States and Europe. And this is a really, really crucial question because, I was just looking through some of the reactions that we've been seeing to this US-Russia meeting, and the fact that Europe has quite clearly been sidelined from this, the fact that Russia is making it very clear that it won't allow Europe to have a seat at the table, will no doubt make many European leaders very nervous. And there is this question of what happens if the United States essentially carves out a deal with Russia and presents it to Ukraine and says, listen, take it or leave it. And if you leave it, then our support for you stops. Our military support for you stops. Our aid money for you stops. And I think that, as somebody pointed out, if Europe wants to stand behind Ukraine, then it's got to come up with a deal of its own, or at least a model for continuing support that would lead somewhere. And that would I think, probably see a dramatic escalation of the crisis and potentially create a rift with the United States. And so I think, yes, potentially, Europe could come back with something, but I think at that moment, I think the worry that Ukraine will probably have, and a lot of European leaders will have, is that that could signal the final break with the United States. And even though I think a lot of people are very unhappy with the direction the United States is taking, they're very nervous about what is happening in the United States at the moment. I think, and for good reason, there's a genuine worry about breaking altogether with Washington. I think part of that is because it's very deeply held to most people, or to many people, certainly. And I have to say that I would certainly, it's something that makes me very nervous about some sort of definitive break from the United States. But at the same time, many would argue that if the United States is just laying down the terms of what would be a fundamentally unjust, and many would argue a dangerous settlement that effectively has handed Putin what he wants, then a lot would say, well, maybe that is the moment that Europe has to stand up for Ukraine. But that could come at a very heavy cost, because if the United States then says, right, fine, okay, you've made your decision, you're on your own, Europe will have to provide the troops that, or would have to certainly provide a lot more military aid to Ukraine. And it would have to provide a lot more financial support to Ukraine. So essentially, I think the problem is that what we're looking at is that whether we like it or not, as things stand at the moment, yes, the United States could very well have the leverage to force a peace deal through on Ukraine without Europe's approval, because it could just say to Kyiv, look, if you don't take this, then we cut off support. And then unless Europe can come back and say, well, in that case, we will continue support with all that entails, including the possible risk of an escalation, because Putin might at that point turn around and say, well, look, if the United States is now broken from Europe and saying Ukraine is no longer our issue, then maybe Russia feels emboldened to say, right, okay, we can expand this war in one way or another that we like, because is the United States going to come to Europe's defense? And there would be real questions about this. So this is actually a huge question. I think, this is why so many European countries are very nervous about this unilateral move that the United States has made, because they feel exactly that if the United States were to cut a deal with Russia and then take that to Ukraine, then Ukraine might feel that it has no option to accept if they can't come up with an alternative. So DH16DH asks, are Eastern European countries being overlooked and underappreciated within Europe, given that only Poland was invited by Macron to the recent emergency meeting? I think you touch on a very important point about the way that the European Union has evolved, that it's tended to be very focused, and for obvious historical reasons, on Western Europe. And there has been this question of, have the Eastern European countries been given their place? I come at this a little bit differently for two reasons. I mean, I think it's quite clear that you couldn't have all the countries in Europe around that table, that it had to be focused on a select group. For many reasons. One, because I think it just would have been out of hand if you had not just the 27, but obviously United Kingdom was involved, so, former EU member. But also you had like the Secretary General of NATO and everything. So I think it was a sense of what is manageable. And within that, it was clearly noticeable that Poland was there. So there was that clear acknowledgement that Poland was an important partner in all of this and needed to be at that top table. I would have been very worried if Poland wasn't there. But the fact that it was there said that I don't think that Eastern Europe is being overlooked. I think what was also very interesting is that you had a decision that was taken by the Nordics, the Scandinavians, I can never remember how you define them, and the Baltics, to be represented by Denmark. So that was also a very powerful message to say that they represent a bloc that are aligned in their views, and they were willing to allow one of their number to speak on their behalf at that. So again, I think it's very clear that you could say, well, look, because you didn't have perhaps Romania, Bulgaria there, maybe one of those two could have been included. Romania might have been a good example to have in the lineup. But I think the fact that you had Poland, which is the most significant of the Eastern European countries, especially on the question of how to handle Russia, was very important. And as I say, the fact that you had the Baltics and a group of the Scandinavian states represented in the case of Denmark, I think was actually a very, very good sign of the way that countries are working with one another within the European Union, that they can form regional blocs as well and nominate one of their number to speak on their behalf. So I'm not quite as worried about this as it might seem. Yes, as I say, I think Eastern Europe's voice was very, very clearly heard in the meeting. So Georges Custafan asks, should Turkey and China participate as intercessors?
What an alpha thing
in the
for
peace
James
negotiation?
Lindsay to do.
George, thank you for bringing this up, because I think
Bro
what
wrote
you're
it
touching
out
on is a
properly,
really
the
interesting
Turkiya.
question about
and James
who will
Lindsay
lead
just refused
any
and called
talks
it Turkey.
that do take place.
Alpha.
And this is
Alpha
fundamentally
move.
important, as we know, in peace processes.
If I
mean,
couldn't like the
you know,
guy any more than
what
I
would be
already
going on
did,
at the moment
you know
is a
why
lot
he
of
did that? Because
discussion
he's in
about
Cyprus.
process.
You know,
process
he's
is
like, nah,
incredibly
fuck
important
this
in peace
country.
processes in all sorts of ways.
He gets it.
And it breaks down into any number of factors. And this is just one of them, but it's an important one. So what we would be sort of thinking about, or what I think we'll be keeping an eye out in the next few weeks, is if this ramps up and it looks like it's going to become a formal process, where is it going to be held? What is the format that's it's going to be run under? And there are a number of different formats. You can have direct talks, you can have mediated process, you can have what's called proximity talks. So effectively what you do is you can have the different parties either in the same building or even actually quite separate from each other, and somebody sort of shuttles between them and sort of says, right, okay, this is what the Russian position is, how do you feel about this? And simplifying it, but essentially that's what it is. But if it is going to be a mediated process, there is this question as to who should be there. And alternatively, you could have it that, if it were to be the case that the United States says, okay, we're going to be there, the Ukrainians are going to be there, and the Europeans manage to force their way into this, which I happen to think is important to do for all sorts of reasons, then it might be the case that Russia says, well, we want another country there, and that could be China. Or alternatively, as you're saying, that what we could have is a question of who will be effectively brokering the process. Now, we've seen this meeting in Riyadh, which has been a significant boost for Saudi Arabia's standing, that it can say, listen, we have got this position that we can actually get United States and Russia to the table. But yes, I mean, there is a very good question about who might be able to do that. I think Turkey is problematic in all sorts of ways.
Can I just not rescue the students
I think
anymore or
that
something?
because it's a NATO member, but you could argue that it's a NATO member that in many ways has retained very good relations with Russia, much to the annoyance and suspicion of many other NATO members, I hasten to add. But I'm not sure that it would be able to fulfill that role. And I'm not also sure that China would want to. Yes, in some ways it would be a significant step forward for its standing in the world, but I think the United States would be very, very unhappy about having China playing that role. So I think you raise a really interesting question about who could do that. But once you start to actually think about it, who's got alliances with whom, what are the interested parties in all of this, then it becomes a very, very different debate. And I wouldn't be surprised if the United States actually sees itself as being the mediator. That effectively it says, listen, if we can cut a good relationship with Russia and persuade Putin that actually what we want is to improve our relations with Russia, then maybe Washington says, well, why can't we be the ones who bring the Russians and Ukrainians into the room together to talk to each other. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out, I mean, as strange as it might seem in some ways, that might be something that Washington sees, its role as being. But this is certainly one of those really, really big questions. And I know you sort of framed it in particular two countries, but I think it opens up a much bigger debate about exactly who is going to take a role, in what capacity, and that will have to be something that will be open to discussions in the coming weeks if it looks like formal negotiations are actually on the cards. 1989 asks, if a deal does take place, how likely is it that the Russian territorial gains are akin to the lines drawn by current military positions? Look, so this again comes back to the point about what is likely to be discussed and whether we have a ceasefire which effectively freezes the conflict, or we have a peace agreement, a formal peace agreement that in some ways acknowledges Russian sovereignty over the territory that it holds, or whether it could be something which is a little bit more nebulous, which sort of lays down the potential for a broader peace agreement that would allow some decision to be taken on that territory at a later date. So that could either mean a referendum held to retain its links with Russia, or the possibility of some sort of agreement that would allow the territory to be reintegrated into Ukraine, for example, under very high degree of autonomy, or perhaps a federal settlement or something like that. But of course, there is also the question about, what lines get drawn. And of course, where it becomes really interesting at the moment is we're not just talking about the lines on the map in Ukraine, but we have the lines on the map in Russia, because, of course, Ukraine has, and it's a very small amount of territory, but it is nevertheless Russian sovereign territory that Ukraine is now occupying as well. And I think, there's an argument to say, well, look, if you're going to draw a ceasefire line that paves the way for a later settlement, then it makes sense to allow Ukraine to sit holding that territory, because it then potentially gives Russia an incentive to regain it. I mean, it is so small as compared to the amount of territory it holds in Ukraine. But I think nevertheless, there's a certain symbolism here that territory that Russia says is our sovereign territory is now sitting in Ukrainian hands, that I think gives it a much greater degree of significance than it might otherwise have had. So I think that's going to be a really, really interesting question. But I mean, one would rather expect that with the possibility of some adjustments, that if we're talking about a ceasefire agreement, then it probably will be along the lines of the territory that's currently held at the moment, and I'm not necessarily expecting to see Russia giving up a large amount of that territory, especially as, particularly, Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea, it's now said represents Russian territory, and I've seen people arguing, well, Russia can't give up territory under its constitution. Yeah, but this was illegally gained. This is not, so it's a little bit deeper than that. But essentially, as I say, I think that we probably will be talking about the lines that on the map that we currently see at the moment. In terms of where the rough discussions on territory is likely to be. Treasure Volspolnata asks, what countries from Europe and outside of Europe could participate in a stabilisation force? Thanks so much for this, because again, I think what I'm trying to do with a lot of these questions is take a really good question to raise a bigger point in what we're seeing in these talks. And I think that this touches on a really, really important element of what sort of peacekeeping force or stabilization force is the term you use, would we be talking about in the event of some sort of agreement? And this will be so important for a number of reasons. So in many cases, one would expect to see a UN peacekeeping force put in place. But I think in this case, there is a lot of reluctance to go down that path. From all sorts of angles. And I'm not sure that a UN peacekeeping force, in fact, I'm almost certain that a UN peacekeeping force wouldn't be an appropriate option in this case. Partly to do with rules of engagement. I think that Ukraine would turn around and say, when you put in a UN peacekeeping force, they're not allowed to fight back. Very strict rules of engagement, that essentially their position is a moral authority, that they stand on a line between two conflicting parties, and they expect that the two parties respect their position as UN peacekeepers enough not to fight their way through them. I don't think Ukraine, I don't think Europe would feel that this is a strong enough guarantee, that there is no reason to say that, Russia wouldn't at some point of its choosing push past those UN peacekeepers, knowing that they can't fight back. So I think Ukraine, and especially given the guarantees that Ukraine had in the past, which it would say weren't in the end worth the paper they were written on, would say we want to have a much greater, a more significant force that Russia would be afraid to push past. And so that then gets into sort of bigger questions. So, I mean, we're talking a lot at the moment. There's talk of Europe saying, well, we could put a force on the ground and things, which would mean that. But that also relies on the fact then that Russia is saying it's not prepared to go to war with the European countries. And I'm not sure that Europe would be confident that's not the case. So you would then want to involve other countries. Now, the ultimate guarantee in all of this would, of course, be the United States. If you had US soldiers on the ground, I think at that point, Russia would take a deep intake of breath and would say, yeah, no, we're not going to go there. But I'm not sure that Russia would accept that model of peacekeeping anyway, so you get into all sorts of discussions, but partly because it would then say, well, if you've got Europeans and you've got Americans on the ground, then this is NATO in effect. Whether or not Ukraine joins NATO, it's NATO in effect. So at that point, I think that the Russians probably would, and the Europeans would probably want to have potentially other countries there that would be close to Russia. The trouble is, could they be trusted by the Ukrainians?
No, they don't.
Any country that would be sort of, trusted enough by Russia. I mean, it's not unrealistic to feel this way. So what about Chinese troops? What about Indian troops, for example? Could they be an element of this? And where would you place them on the line? Because, of course, if you say, right, okay, if it's Indian troops and they're put in one place, does that then become a weak point? that Russia would simply indicate to India, look, we're preparing to do an invasion. We're going to push past where your troops are. You better move them out the way and not stop us from doing what we want to do. So you get into very, very complex questions that don't come up with UN peacekeeping forces, where the sides do by and large respect the authority of the UN. But I think in this case, the feeling would be that that isn't going to be enough. But then you get into very complex questions about who could do that role. So again, I think that this is a really, really huge element, and I think hopefully also, along with the other questions that I'm answering, serves to underscore just how complex these negotiations are going to be. I mean, a lot of people just think, well, let's freeze the conflict and Ukraine doesn't join NATO. And that seems to be the position the United States is taking on this. It's a lot more than that. There will be questions about the process. There will be questions about the implementation. And this is one of those questions. Du Bois asks, is Ukraine's desire to join NATO still a possibility? And will the rest of NATO have a seat at the table? Again, this follows on directly from the previous question about peacekeeping, because this is, of course, another one of those factors that will really have to be thought about in any negotiating process. So it seems that the United States is now of the view, certainly the Trump administration is of the view, that Ukraine won't be joining NATO. I think that Ukraine certainly sees this as not just viable, but essential to its future security. You have Keir Starmer as British Prime Minister saying that NATO, that Ukraine still has a path to NATO membership. I think there will be a lot of other European countries that feel the same way, that ultimately it's only NATO membership that is going to provide Ukraine with the security that it needs, and many would argue that it deserves. You have the question about what you do about the division and how you deal with that if Ukraine becomes a member. But I think that can be addressed with there is a political formula for that, of saying, look, Ukraine is divided, but it was divided not of its own will. And that, yes, a ceasefire exists. NATO membership will only extend to that ceasefire line. So if Russia were to set foot across that ceasefire line, then that would be Article 5. But that doesn't apply to the territories that are currently under Russian occupation. So effectively, it would kick it down, kick the whole issue down the line
also,
to a later stage, maybe when you have a change of government in Russia.
To say that, Cuba's not thriving, I don't... obviously there's major fucking problems, baby formula, cars, stuff like that. But, it certainly could be doing a lot better, But, let's just check out some quick little stats on it real quick. So, let's see. Yeah, not very much freedom there. Political rights has a 1. That's fucking awful. It's lower rated than Venezuela and Nicaragua. According to this, Haiti has more, that's why it's this is, doesn't necessarily mean it's a better place to live, because I certainly wouldn't want to live in Haiti, who's not communist. I wonder what's going wrong there. Criminalize forced labor, criminalize human trafficking, Legal age of marriage. Wow, this isn't that much different than the United States' issues with slavery, is it? That's interesting, huh? I love this. Literally, get rid of the 14th Amendment. And then what's Cuba fucking... Where is it? Slave line going to? Does it even say? Uh-oh, what's the highest one here? That's not good. That doesn't seem very free to me. Literally, it's at the same place as El Salvador. That's crazy. Doesn't say necessarily what product lines are as involved with their slavery, but that's okay. See what Heritage Foundation has to say about this. Am I right? Am I crazy? Oh, wait. Okay, I got fooled because they had D here. I was like, wait, am I crazy or is Cuba not in here? There's 76% inflation. They don't even rate Afghanistan. That's crazy. Wow, Azerbaijan has a better score than Cuba. That's cray cray. Discuss with us on Twitter. Yeah, whoa. Really low. Really fucking low scores. Still would rather be there than Haiti, though. You know? Maybe Honduras and Venezuela as well, but I don't know. Yeah, 76% inflation, just like Biden's America. Am I right? Yeah. Like, what even is America's inflation at that point? Like, what is Heritage Foundation's arbitrary score here? I hate when they put it under United States, so I have to scroll down to you. Give me America. Eight percent inflation. When we get a score over time, will that give us inflation over time? Inflation. Fuck. Biden's America. Boy, those scores sure did drop, huh? So something happened in this year, and then after this year, look at it go down. It's flattening out, though. Flattening out.
Some point in the future that might be more in line with trying to do a deal. But a lot of that would also then depend on Europe's relationship with Russia. Is Europe holding back enough to make that sort of worthwhile, to do a land settlement at some point, which finally resolves that issue? So you've got a whole range of those points that sort of come into it as well. So yes, I would say that the desire to join NATO is still a possibility. It's probably unlikely because I think the United States, certainly under Trump, is not going to allow this. But I'm not. So in many ways, you could argue that the question here is, as part of an agreement, is it that you suspend NATO membership and United States gives an undertaking that this isn't on the path, or do you rescind any talk and just sort of set it in stone that Ukraine's future military orientation will be neutrality? And I think, a lot in Ukraine will feel very, very worried about that. That just opens up the door for a further Russian attack at a later stage. So again, just as it was with the peacekeeping, just as it was on the question of land, this is a hugely complex issue that will need to be discussed in a lot of detail. And we are also, again, seeing fairly large differences arising between the United States and certainly, if not all, the European Union, then I think a significant number of important EU members and other European countries. Branscombe asks, what will happen to the thousands of Ukrainian children allegedly abducted from the occupied areas?
Allegedly?
I am so pleased that you raised this issue because, again, this is another one of those questions that will have to be addressed. And I'm going to frame it in a slightly broader context because obviously this is incredibly important. It's important from a humanitarian point of view. It's also incredibly important because there is, of course, indictments against Vladimir Putin and another Russian official for having overseen that taking of those children from Ukraine. And remembering, of course, that under the Genocide Convention, taking children from a group constitutes genocide. So effectively, Russia has been accused of being complicit in genocide. Now, a lot would argue it's been accused of all sorts of other war crimes, and you're absolutely right. But this is incredibly important. But it also needs to be framed in the context of a bigger issue of, in this situation, there will have to be significant talks on prisoner exchanges. You've got a lot of prisoners of war that will have to be negotiated as well. So what I'm saying is that the question of hostages, of prisoners of war, will be a fundamentally important part of any overall peace deal. The Ukrainian government will say we cannot possibly entertain the idea of an agreement with Moscow unless those children are returned. And I think a lot of countries will agree with that. But you're also dealing with a really interesting question, of course, because you have these indictments against Putin and this other official. And whether Russia then says, as part of any peace agreement, well, we want this lifted somehow. And we know what the United States position on the International Criminal Court is at the moment. And I think this is where it's been really interesting that, one of the first things that was discussed after, during that talk between Trump and Putin was reciprocal visits to Washington and Moscow. And as we saw when Netanyahu went to Washington, Washington would happily, I think, welcome Putin, or certainly Trump would happily welcome Putin to Washington as part of this big plan that he's put together. But it would be welcoming somebody who is accused of very, very serious war crimes, not just on, obviously, as I say, abducting the children, but on a whole range of other issues. So to answer the question specifically, this is going to have to be another part of that process. It's dealing with the hostages, it's dealing with the prisoners of war, which will be a very, very thorny issue. That partly because also in dealing with it, Russia will have to admit its
not
guilt.
looking good for
in
me
effect.
after
it
I
will have to say
scan
yes,
this
we
planet.
took
It's
them.
gonna-
So it's
it's
one
gonna be a
thing
difficult
capturing
escape
prisoners,
here.
prisoners of war. It's one thing capturing soldiers and saying, "Yeah, we're holding on to them until the end of the war."
Here it comes.
Fine.
Go, 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 go,
It's
go,
a
go,
very
go, go, go,
different
go,
thing
go,
when
go.
you're then having to hold up your hands and say, "Yeah, here are all these children that we're going to hand back," and that shows that they had been taken. I mean, obviously Russia would say, well, we took them humanitarian, their family had been killed and that was all because of Ukraine's decisions and whatever. But it still will have to be something that will be addressed. And it will require mediation. So, for example, on prisoners of war, I've seen reports that the United Arab Emirates is taking a very keen role in doing that and probably will go ahead. And I think probably on this, you will also be looking for third countries, which would then say, right, okay, we'll help deal with this issue. But it will be an incredibly important part in any process as well. Nathan Lowry asks, is this appeasement? Nathan, I'm sort of conflicted on this. I think part of me wants to say a clear yes, part of me wants to say no, and I think this is where the sort of historian side of my background clashes with the political science part of my background. I think appeasement was based on a misguided idea that you could do a deal that Britain felt that it could do a deal with Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler, and that if Hitler was given what he demanded in Czechoslovakia, then that would be the end of the story. And of course, that was completely misguided. It was a policy that was based on naivety in many ways. I don't think that this is driven by the same factors, if I'm to be really honest. I don't think that there's a naivety that exists in the United States and in the Trump White House about what Putin will do. So I don't think it's that, they're saying to themselves, yes, if we give Putin what he wants on Ukraine, that'll be the end of the story. I think it's more that it's an apathy towards Europe, towards Ukraine, a complete disregard. I think it's just saying, look, we have a policy of making United States, make America great again. Our fundamental challenge is China. What does it take? And this comes back to the earlier question. What does it take to peel Russia off from China? I think, again, it's Trump saying, I don't really care what happens after. What I want is the acknowledgement that I solved this issue, and that, as long as it can stand for as long as I'm in the White House, that's all I care about. I think it's also that fact of, as I say, it comes back to that question. I think there's a business element, that it's sort of, this is a business opportunity that Russia is telling Trump, look, you solved this problem with us. We can open up we can do fantastic business, the biggest business you've ever seen. And I think all of that is appealing. So in that sense, yes, it is appeasement because it's giving Russia what it wants. But I think that the underlying factors, and I think that, for all the criticism of Chamberlain, I think that, he was essentially pursuing a policy that he felt might, it was better than war. But it led to war anyway. I think this is driven by a very, very different set of factors. But yes, I think I can see an argument that essentially the United States, for its own reasons, or certainly Trump for his own reasons and those around him, are willing to do a deal with Russia because they're looking to a very, very different set agenda. So again, it's yes and no. It is an appeasement like we saw with Hitler in the 1930s. But it is essentially sort of saying, right, okay, let's give Russia what it wants because then we will benefit from it in all sorts of ways as they see it. Dinaric Wolf asks, Do you think a peace treaty would hold for long, or will the war eventually reignite again? This, of course, is really the big question in all of this. That whatever is agreed, how durable will it be? And there is obviously a great deal of skepticism in European circles about how much we can trust Putin. And I would say that...
Okay. Thoughts on Comrade Kim Jong-il and his leadership during the... What? I don't care about what Kim Jong-un did. It's not really relevant today.
I would completely go along with that. I think potentially, had it just been Ukraine, we could say, well, look, there were historic reasons as Russia saw it, not justifying those reasons for one moment, but it isn't just Ukraine that we're talking about. We're talking about territory of Georgia that has been, it was invaded and occupied, and Russia has accepted the independence of those two breakaway territories. It's the same with Moldova, and then we've seen Ukraine. So this is part and parcel of a pattern that we have seen in Moscow. And so I think that there is a real fear that unless this agreement is put together very well, unless the proper guarantees are put in place, then what is to say that, as many argue, that Russia will simply sit behind that ceasefire line, rearm itself, and wait till an opportune moment to push ahead. And of course, the other point to raise in all of this is that, very often what you find is, even on these ceasefire lines, there's all sorts of incidents that take place. Sometimes it can be quite serious, hot incidents of troops sparring against each other, but it's also little provocations the whole time. It's taking a bit of territory here, taking a bit of territory there, and they can be extremely unstable. And so it's not just the element of a willful Russian decision to reignite a war with a major invasion again, but it would also be sort of little incidents constantly building up, which I think would be very, very dangerous and problematic. So I think there has got to be a lot of worry that if it is just going to be a ceasefire, even if it's a peace agreement, how durable will it be? How long could it last? Can Putin be trusted on this? And there will be those who will say, well, no, he's got what he wants. But again, and coming through all of these questions, one feeds into another, feeds into another. The previous question I talked about was about, exactly the appeasement. Many will feel, and I think for good reason, that Putin won't be satisfied in all of this. But whether it would be a case that a future regime in Moscow might take a very different approach and say, but a lot will then depend on what is held back. What are the incentives that you bake into any agreement that would encourage good long-term behaviour? And so this, again, is another element that I think will be so very, very important. What do you do?
Watch how fast reefers will come for me.
Russian reintegration according to meeting very, very strict criteria? Or do you hold off altogether until Russia just gives back all the territory? Then again, you get into the split that I mentioned about between the United States, which looks very keen to try and rebuild business ties with Moscow, and the European Union, which takes a rather different view on all of this. So, I think there would be a worry about it.
Fast.
I think there are ways maybe you can mitigate that. But the question is whether you can take those steps and maintain the fundamental sense of Western unity, which will be required to make that work. And that I'm not sure about. And I think this really does come down to this, why at the moment so many are worried about this great split between Washington and the European Union, or Washington and European countries on how to deal with Ukraine, because this only works, whatever it is in terms of stabilization, whatever it is in terms of a territorial arrangement, ceasefire. This only really will work and be secure if the United States and Europe work together on it. If you've got Washington saying we want this better relationship with Moscow, and we're going to do our thing, you're on your own now, then I think the chances of a resume war at some point sooner rather than later is going to be very high indeed. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for now. As ever, there were far more questions than I could hope to cover in just one video, and I may try to come back to more of them in another one. In the meantime, here are some more videos that you might find useful. Thanks so much for watching.
And that's radioactive contamination. Very radioactive.
Genius or absolutely insane? The choice is yours, guys, but I would definitely not be trying this myself, I can tell you that much. The clip that you guys just watched was taken from a broadcast back in 1985, and the man seen in this clip is a very notable figure from the nuclear industry, a man by the name of Galen Windsor. And there's one particular reason why Galen is so famous in the nuclear industry. It's because of his radical and controversial beliefs about the safety of radioactive material. This clip was taken during one of his many presentations to show just how safe uranium is. He can be seen dumping out a small portion of radioactive metal onto his hand, testing it with a Geiger counter, and then licking it off of his hand. To go the extra mile and show people that he really did this, he also puts the Geiger counter to his mouth, which gets a pretty strong reading, and then he swallows and licks the rest off of his hand. And this might come as a surprise, but Galen was actually somewhat correct here. The uranium that he consumed was not water soluble, meaning it can't mix in, and therefore his body was not going to metabolize it. Instead, it was just going to pass through. In fact, the craziest part about this is that the uranium Galen consumed would be more of a risk when it came to kidney toxicity than it would radioactivity, at least in the short term. This also wasn't the only demonstration that Galen would do to prove his perspective. He would oftentimes take swims in pools meant for storing old used-up nuclear rods. He would drink from the water as well without ever suffering any ill effects. He was also a big believer in the fact that nuclear radiation and its dangers
I do want to
were
swim in
often
one of those
overstated.
pools, but I'm not
Many
gonna.
times he
No
would say
way,
that
Jose.
The reason this was so was because a small group of people wanted to control this very powerful resource. Therefore, the way to do that was through fear. Now, of course, because of all these demonstrations and his consistent preaching that radiation really wasn't all that dangerous, this ignited a bunch of debates between different people and safety protocols in the industry. But despite Mr. Windsor's beliefs, there are still a lot of concerns, as well as compensation claims from people who have worked in these areas in close proximity to nuclear items. Personally, whether or not Galen was correct, in my opinion, is not a black and white issue. I think there might be some aspects of his argument that have some merit, as well as some that don't. Either way, Galen actually ended up living a very long life, over 80 years old, and he passed away in 2008, at least 20 years after he consumed this uranium live. I could tell you right now, though, I do think it's a better idea to have more safety restrictions than less, especially when it comes to radioactive material. In any event, let me know what you guys think about this.
Yeah, we
in the
don't need
comment
those
section
federal
below.
agencies
Let me know what you guys
monitoring
want to see
that
next.
shit.
I have my Patreon linked to my bio if you guys want to check that out and help support the channel.
Am
I'll
I
see you
right?
guys in the next video. Peace out.
Who needs agencies?
Well, thanks to TikTok and Alicia Amira, the bimbo archetype has now resurfaced in the media once again. We are reanimating the nostalgia of the silicone-breasted, peroxide blonde, and her vacant, coal-lined eyes.
Let's go!
However, on her second time around, the bimbo is being portrayed in a positive way. Originally derogative, the bimbo was meant to characterize a woman of heightened sexual allure and low intelligence. Now the bimbo is being reconstituted as a breathless, unburdened goddess, a ruler of society and her own self-assurance. During such a renaissance, I feel the need to provide my perspective on the bimbo and why she deserves her reconciliation as a divine being. As an artist, my subject matter has frequently been the woman of sexual liberation, the fallen woman, the mentally ill woman, the siren, and of course, the bimbo. Through my study of various realities and myths of female archetypes, the bimbo was not immediately respected as something extraordinary, just like it wasn't from the 20s to the early 2000s. But as I matured and my artistic sensibilities sharpened, the bimbo gradually rose to saint-like status in my mind. The bimbo is an indifferent, cheerful spectacle of foolishness with the voluptuous body of a Venus to match. I talk about indifference on this channel a lot and its relation to beauty. Indifference, as I had described it, is more than just not caring what others think of you, but it is a charisma that elevates you above the worries of the average man or woman. Being indifferent means being divine. When you look at religious portraiture, for example, the composure of those portrayed is always placid and separate. They are solipsistic. Their gaze does not stare at you, but beyond you, a look that is almost vacant. The bimbo's empty gaze is not one of confusion or lack of intellect, but an indication of their mastery of society. They are unbothered, unconcerned, and pure. They are free from society's intellectual bondage by virtue of their obliviousness. Untethered, the bimbo does not feel weighted down by cynicism or the barbarity of human interactions. She has no fear, and with a lack of fear comes unrestrained love and selflessness. Now, whether or not you are familiar with the tarot, you've probably seen this card before, as it is part of the major arcana. The bimbo, I would say, bears an eerie familial relation to this specific card. The Fool, according to Penguin's Classics Dictionary of Symbols, is such. This is the most mysterious, enthralling, and hence most disturbing card in the tarot. He is outside the pack, that is, the human city, beyond the walls. The observer concludes that he is a fool. The Hermetic philosopher, however, will mutter that this is a master. He walks unhesitatingly. He goes forward. The fool is not nothingness, but rather emptiness. When no possessions are needed, the individual's consciousness becomes that of the world and of its totality in human and physical terms. He goes forward, conspicuously solar, across the virgin soil of knowledge beyond the city of men. This Hermetic philosopher the scholar speaks of in this definition would say that too much knowledge or worldly dependence begets ignorance and hedonism. In order to reach deification, our attachments to this plane of flesh and suffering and ego must be severed. The moment of transcendence is one of achieved purity and refinement of the mind and body.
You think you hit the button
the bimbo
to
resembles
unmute your mic,
the fool,
and you never do.
walking aimlessly onward, outside the citadel of public scrutiny, not because of her choice to do so, but because it is her divine nature. She is the master, the spotless mind. Ignorance is not bliss, but peace. Now, I hope you didn't think I forgot all about that body and hair. Equally the fool, the bimbo is the love goddess. She raises her cosmetic routine to ritualism and wields her body as a fact of her presence on Earth. Her voluptuousness does not represent vanity, wealth, or any material status,
that are like
but her
hella deep, am I
capacity
right?
for love and kindness. The Venus of Willendorf, for example, with her bulbous form and discreet face, mirror the bimbo's exuberant and non-dismissible sexuality, as well as her insouciance to the hypnotic effects it has in casual interaction. Discarding the flesh, she operates simultaneously on the heavenly plane and the earthly one. The bimbo is blind, self-contained, and her body is the involuntary physical swell of her sensual abundance. The bimbo is not the cheap, disposable, hard body she was considered to be in the 80s and 90s. She's the representation of God in her physical form as well as her mental absence. Today, and hopefully more frequently in the future, we start to look at her with reverence.
Hello, everyone.
Oh,
so
God.
for this final episode
Could
of
be louder.
Me dissecting Ethan Klein's little content puke on Hassan Piker, I thought that I would go nuclear
Bro,
and
you see hear him? He said content puke. Ha!
show you who he really is. So Ethan Klein, despite being married to a terrorist wife, talks quite a big game about being opposed to terrorism, doesn't he? Constantly accusing others of supporting terrorism and stuff like that, Hassan Piker in particular. He also talks a big game about opposing sexual violence and stuff like that, and has even recently outright stated that he has evidence that Hassan Piker is a supposed sex criminal.
He looks like someone at a Big Lebowski party, you know, where he...
Jackie Treehorn?
Yeah, he looks like he's at a Jackie Treehorn party. You know, fucking drunk women. Which surprisingly doesn't seem too far off from what he actually does do. Or has done, at least.
So I want to show you what I do actually have receipts for, which is Ethan Klein straight up sexually harassing a 17-year-old victim of terrorism of the Boston bombing. It is incredibly hard to watch, but I'm going to show it here anyway because it needs to be shown. And I seriously warn you that this is probably like one of the worst things that you will ever have seen in a YouTube video. Ethan Klein sexually harassing a teenager.
I'm ready.
A teenage terrorist victim, just to give you an idea of how much this guy actually really does care about supposed sex crimes, sexual assaults, and about victims of terrorism, as he poshes as caring about. Just look at this. Healy is clearly filming him while he does this, and the guy's like borderline touching himself during this.
Hey guys. Thanks for joining me on edgy material warning number 3. We've got some edgy material here. And watch your hands, because you're going to get cut up on this.
Just for the context here, this was a Boston bombing victim who was 17 at the time of the attack, and who, in defiance of what happened to her, you know, she posed for a photo shoot where she wrote, "You can scar me, but you can't stop me," and other such slogans on her body to be like, you know, I'm moving on after what you did to me, you know, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And this is Ethan Klein's reaction to that.
This one here, guys. You can scar me, but you can't stop me. Now that is interesting.
And just to be clear here, this gets straight up like not safe for YouTube.
Okay, go ahead.
So there's going to be parts here that I am going to have to censor.
It's okay.
It's very deep and poetic, but what's even more interesting is if we just go a couple pixels down. Boom. That's some good camel toe, girl. Yeah, nothing like making a political statement like showing off that camel hoof.
Just to reiterate here, what he thinks is a political statement is saying that you'll move on after you're a victim of a terrorist attack.
Girl, yeah, let me get down with that shit, boy. Can smell it from here. Shit. Pretty brutal scars. Nothing that a heavy night of fucking won't incur, you know what I mean?
This is a 17-year-old girl.
Yeah. Anyway, ignoring the camel fucking that fat, juicy, juvenile vagina. Nigga wants to fuck that shit, boy. Yeah. Ignoring that, you can scar me, son, but you can't stop me. Yeah. I wonder It's very powerful, but I wonder if they also, what they wrote on the people who died during the race. You can kill me, but you can't stop her. I wonder if
This is a guy who tries to frame himself as an advocate for victims of terrorism and like an advocate for victims of sexual assault. This is fucking insane, dude.
if the bodies were still in the street. You can
Wow.
kill me, but you can't stop this girl who was...
Good thing immediately after this, ISIS put a stop to trying to, out extreme yourselves on fucking YouTube content. Like, if anyone, Ethan probably benefited more than most people when it comes to the adpocalypse because, the filthy frankifying of YouTube in like 2014 before ISIS fucking put an end to it. Yes, that's right. We can all thank ISIS for not having this. Imagine how much more extreme the cringe of like how extreme can we get with our edgy content. Imagine how much more extreme it would have gotten if it wasn't for ISIS. So everyone say thanks, ISIS. Now we don't have just constant Ethan Klein N-words because that's what he would probably end up doing because, that's where the fucking industry would go.
Luckily a couple feet away from me, so she didn't die. Whoa, good job to her. By the way, I didn't know if you guys saw, but you can see her vagina, and this makes it a much more powerful image, especially in the Reddit community where this image received over 2,000 upvotes. So this is a very successful, very powerful, very edgy photo of a girl's vagina, accompanied also by some text that was sharpied onto her stomach, and boy, what can you say about a photo like this?
Okay.
She's got a nice... I fuck her face. She got a nice smug face. Good to fuck.
And he already said at the beginning, juvenile, and now let's just listen to what he's saying about her.
I would ram I would ram that 2-inch cock so far down her throat, about 2 inches deep. But that's enough to incur a gag reflex in about, I would say, most women. And I hope she can keep that smug smile for me that whole time, you know what I mean? Yeah, girl. Let me fuck.
I wonder how well this did at the time and how well this went over at the time.
That smug little face of yours, boy. Yeah. She got some nice eyebrows, too. Very well groomed and a nice haloing light effect. Now, let's scroll down here, guys. And just one.
This is like watching like movies like August Underground where I'm like, can it just be over? Like people are like, oh, it's the most disturbing movie ever. And then I'm watching it and I'm just like, this movie is fucking awful and it's just a person screaming the entire time at the end here. Can we fucking like end this movie, please? Like, and like the only reason I'm watching August Underground is because like I made statements about movies that were disturbing and some idiot was like, that's not even disturbing, have you seen August Underground? And then I watched it and I said, this is dumb. Like, you can't just like, there's two elements to make a disturbing movie, okay? It has to be watchable, okay, as starters, and then the next part is it has to be disturbing. That's why Solo isn't like extremely disturbing, like, because it's not a good movie.
More time here, skipping over the text, which isn't as important as the vagina shot that we've all enjoyed here so much. And in fact, if you can get a little bit closer, you can actually see the contours of her vagina hoof. And this is more of a camel hoof. This is something like a brontosaurus cleft. This is where the labia meets the leg, and if you have a nice tight little shorts like this, you can just bear all. And then my guess is that she's not even wearing underwear in this shot. So big up to her for being brave, getting out here and making this very powerful political statement about her proximity to the bomb being less close than all the other ones who died. You can scar her, but you can't stop her, guys. And never forget.
Like, obviously
Boston
he's joking, but at the same time, it's like, okay, like you're trying way too hard here.
Bombing 2013, guys. Never forget. They can scar us. They can scare us. But they sure can't stop us, boy. Yeah. Just
There you go, everyone. That is Ethan and Gila Klein on terrorism victims. That is.
It's not funny at all. Yeah, I guess the joke is also that it is stupid, but like the fact that she was 17, I don't care. Like you know, if maybe this would make me a little bit more on the upset side instead of like having like I'm bored with this. If he knew it was 17 ahead of time and that could be proven, then I would be like, wow, that's pretty fucked up. Like one of this era, one of my favorite jokes, I don't know who said it, but I think it's called Beasts of the Southern Wild. Yes. Okay, so this movie right here. So this little girl, she's like she was up for an Academy Award and she would have been like the youngest ever, or she may have been the youngest nominated. And then Hush Puppy. Okay, so this is her name. Say, we're gonna type in the word cunt after. Okay. Yeah, the Onion had to. It was the Onion of all people. I thought it was gonna be like an edgy comedian, but it was the fucking Onion. Oh my god. They had to issue an apology over this. Look, peak this era, same time period as that Ethan video here. Yeah, so on Twitter, everyone else seems to be afraid to say it, but that Quincy Wallace is kind of a cunt, right? Oscars 2013. Now this is fucking hilarious, okay? This is how you do the edgy comedy of 2013. Calling a 9-year-old a cunt and then having to apologize about it.
Ethan and Gila Klein harassing a minor terrorism victim, and Ethan outright stating
minor terrorism
in no uncertain
victim
terms that he knows her age and that he, wants to rape her, basically. So yeah, there you go. What more is there to be said?
A lot, honestly. I want a good empanada. We should have called our channel
raging
that.
About Hakeem Jeffries. Here he is on MSNBC with Nicole Wallace talking about Eric Adams, the New York City mayor, and the Department of Justice. Sam and I covered this extensively on Friday, but there was a bombshell accusation by Donald Trump's interim, I guess it was U.S. attorney at the Southern District, who was a lifelong, basically conservative, had clerked for Scalia, and she resigned and accused the Trump administration of basically engaging in a quid pro quo. She said it in her letter. Then there were multiple folks who resigned rather than implement the dropping of this Adams case so that he could enforce Trump's deportations regime until they finally got to their Bork, somebody who was going to appease Donald Trump and his mafia-style tactics over there at the department, I guess with Pam Bondi as the Attorney General. And so this is such a clear violation of the Constitution and the law, and it's one of the many constitutional crises that we're facing right now. So good thing we have Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the Democratic Party, who is also from the state that this embattled, corrupt mayor is serving in. Good thing we have him to say, hey, this is outrageous. Oh, wait.
I want to ask your opinion about Eric Adams' ability to govern the city of New York. And if you agree with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who says he's currently being coerced by Donald Trump.
He's going to have to make the case
to New Yorkers that he still has the capacity to behave as an independently elected official, not someone who's taking orders or who is on a short leash relative to the Department of Justice. It should trouble everyone that this decision was made to recommend the dismissal of charges, which ultimately a judge will have to approve, but only to dismiss the charges without prejudice, which effectively means it can be brought back at any point in time. And so there is a prosecutorial gun being put to the head of the elected mayor of the city of New York. That's deeply disturbing. And the mayor's going to have to answer those questions to the people that I represent in Brooklyn and to the people throughout New York City.
Is he compromised?
I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and he's going to have to answer that question sooner rather than later.
It's not a question.
Not just through his words, but through his actions.
I mean,
Okay. It's just, I mean, how can Danielle Sassoon, again, somebody who Trump had appointed on January 21st, how long ago? What, was this 2017? Oh, 2025. So she was in her position for 3 weeks. Again, that woke mind virus, it's very, very contagious. This was her letter here. On February 10th, 2025, I received a memorandum from Acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais directing me to dismiss the indictment against Mayor Eric Adams without prejudice, subject to certain conditions which require leave of court. I do not repeat here the evidence against Adams that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed federal crimes. Mr. Beauvais rightly has never called into question that the case team conducted this investigation with integrity and that the charges against Adams are serious and supported by fact and law. Mr. Beauvais' memo, however, which directs me to dismiss an indictment returned by a duly constituted grand jury for reasons having nothing to do with the strength of the case, raises serious concerns that render the contemplated dismissal inconsistent with my ability and duty to prosecute federal crimes without fear or favor and to advance good faith arguments before the courts. Just the scroll down to the second page here, where she explains, but the footnote was the part that was the most explosive. She says in this footnote, very clearly, I attended a meeting on January 31st, 2025 with Mr. Beauvais, Adams's counsel, by the way, Trump's counsel as well, and members of my office. Adams's attorneys repeatedly urged what amounted to a quid pro quo, indicating that Adams would be in a position to assist with the department's enforcement priorities only if the indictment were dismissed. Mr. Beauvais admonished a member of my team who took notes during the meeting and directed the collection of those notes at the meeting's conclusion. This is, again, a Scalia clerk, a Federalist Society conservative, a Trump appointee from less than a month ago, who is more explicit about the acts of criminality involving Eric Adams and Donald Trump than the House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries when being served up on a silver platter that very notion by a former Republican operative on MSNBC, Nicole Wallace, who seemed more perturbed by his lack of strong language than he did. Quid pro quo said there by Sassoon. Who is Eric Adams' constituency? He's about to completely tank out in the polls. Who is Hakeem Jeffries defending? Who is this for? Who is this for? Because for me, it's not as simple to be like, oh, it's about, Eric Adams. He's an establishment Democrat. No, he's a former Republican. He's got no real ties to the party. You could easily cast him aside, except that they're afraid to take a position. If the roles have been reversed and Biden was threatening like Eric Adams with this indictment to say, you got to implement my DEI policies or else. I'll drop these charges if you put in DEI in New York City. And we'll hold that over your head until we actually see that you faithfully execute it. The amount of scandal that this would be on the right and the amount that Republicans would be screaming from their rooftops about this would be indescribable.
Yep.
I mean, it's just a complete failure. And AOC calling for his resignation is exactly what the entire Democratic Party should be following suit on that front.
And calling Hochul to remove him.
Yes.
And people might be wondering, why is that Hakeem
I hope
Jeffries
Hochul removed him. It would be the
clear
first
charisma
good
suck?
thing
Why is he
Hochul has
leading
done
the
that people
party
would
right
approve
now?
of.
2 reasons. He's reliable on corporate interests. He went to California, which is quite a ways away from New York City, to go butter up Silicon Valley tech executives. That was a few days after he was talking to Zionist groups about how, look, what we accomplished under Biden. He, 10 years ago, was at a rally saying, Israel now, Israel, what was it? Israel today, Israel tomorrow, Israel forever. That's why he's been groomed for this position.
The donor class, I mean, Nancy Pelosi was very famous about being able to rake in donor money, and Jeffries is her heir apparent. But she's so far has proved to be a more talented leader of the Democrats than he has, because this has been outrageous. I mean, I frankly I can't see her coming out there and giving that mealy mouth of a response. She's been horrible on some things, but at least she did some more partisanship than this. I mean, the level of lack of fight here is it's pissing off mainstream liberals. They're going, that press conference that Jeffries did where he said, I have no leverage, resonated beyond just lefty circles.
They've been failed. Liberals have been failed.
They've been failed.
They were
They've
failed
been told
last year.
They've been told that resisting Donald Trump is the most important thing, and now all of their leaders are saying, what can we do? Let's wait and see. Well, we don't have any leverage. And the thing is that those folks actually believed it. As do I, as should we all. But leadership is not on the same page.
I find it a little concerning with Jeffries too. I'm curious if you guys think this is just an aesthetic thing for him, but he is literally subject verb Democrat talking points. I don't know if he's actually capable of offering an opinion on something.
No.
He literally, anytime he probably in that interview about BA's question about Eric Adams probably somehow managed to shoehorn in him saying we're building the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, as well as saying that we're going to work on comprehensive immigration reform in a bipartisan way. He has no ability to communicate anything that what seemingly is put into a binder for him by his aides and then highlighted. It's we talk about authenticity, and this is about being a currency right now for politicians, and this is what we have as the House minority.
Because unless they are explicitly social democratic, and Ken Klippenstein made a joke, Hakeem Jeffries is making me second guess the gerontocracy focus. Good, because the gerontocracy is not the problem here. It's not. And Pelosi and what was good about Biden before he became a mass murderer was that they existed in a time where actually politics was even better, than even more functional, more responsive than the current Democrats are. This new crop, unless they, again, are explicitly either progressive or social democratic, they're going to be worse. They are going to be more craven, and they're going to be less likely, less able to fight. And the way they will be able to fight is going to be counterproductive.
Hakeem Jeffries literally is Democrat Mitch McConnell.
JR in Philly says Hakeem Jeffries is when you order Obama from Temu. Vegetable sauce. Your Democratic leadership is doing nothing because they are benefiting personally, if not politically.
They're accelerationists.
Mayor Eric says, this is America, baby, the New York City of the world. Emma Vingman, why you be my hater? All right, thanks, Eric. God is still on the toilet says 3 deputy mayors in New York City intend to quit protests over Eric Adams' continuing role as mayor. Exactly.
Hey, he's got to prove. He's got a lot of questions to answer. No, we're done asking questions, Hakeem.
Yes, the conclusion is here. We have our answers.
All we have to do is flood the zone. Every day we hit them with 3 things. They'll bite on one, and we'll get all of our stuff done. Bang, bang, bang. These guys will never be able to recover.
That's Steve Bannon spelling out the strategy. Overwhelm Americans with news so Trump can quietly push his real agenda. This is the shock doctrine in action, and it's happening right now. Trump is flooding the news cycle with executive.
Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett. Amna Nawaz is away. On the NewsHour tonight,
the impact of President Trump's mass firings across the federal workforce, how it's affecting the basic functions of government and the lives of thousands of workers. Plus, echoes of the past, how one expert says the first few weeks of President Trump's second term look like some autocracies.
No
Americans
way.
haven't seen this before, so they don't know what it means. Trump 1.0 didn't do as much lasting damage as Trump 2.0 has already done in the first few weeks.
And how the gutting of billions of dollars of U.S. foreign aid threatens the livelihoods of American farmers.
What did I say? What did I say? What have I been saying? Thank you, PBS, for vindicating everything I said about American
Major
farmers.
funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
On an American Cruise Line's journey along the legendary Mississippi River, travelers explore Civil War battlefields and historic riverside towns. Aboard our fleet of American riverboats, you can experience local culture and cuisine and discover the music and history of the mighty Mississippi. American Cruise Lines, proud sponsor of PBS NewsHour.
The ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Chlorfine and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The federal government is closed today in observance of President's Day, but the Trump administration's effort to permanently scale back the size and scope of the federal workforce continues in full force. As Laura Barone-Lopez reports, President Trump's actions in his first few weeks also fueled demonstrations on this holiday weekend.
Where is Congress?
This President's Day,
This is what democracy looks like.
protests across the country pushing back against President Trump's first month in office and what organizers say are his anti-democratic and illegal actions. They call it the No King's Day protest, even as the president suggested in social media posts this weekend that he is above the law, stating
Quoting
he who
Napoleon.
saves his country does not violate any law. Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin responded on CBS.
The dominant objective of this administration is corruption and lawlessness.
Trump's declaration comes as his administration faces multiple restraining orders from judges, who've in some cases said his actions are likely unconstitutional. One of those cases could be the first test for the U.S. Supreme Court, after the president fired the head of a federal agency that protects whistleblowers. A lower court blocked him. But the Trump administration has asked the High Court to uphold the removal of Hampton Dellinger as head of the Office of Special Counsel. As the White House battles in the courts, billionaire Elon Musk's government takeover grows. Musk's team, the so-called
It was
Department
up
of
at the
Government
top the whole
Efficiency,
time.
is seeking unlimited access to highly sensitive Internal Revenue Service systems that hold taxpayer data for millions
It's
of
gonna be a
Americans.
close one to get away
And over the
from.
holiday weekend, Musk's team fired tens of thousands of federal workers across the government. On Friday, the Department of Health and Human Services started terminating probationary employees. That's expected to total more than 5,000 jobs, including almost a tenth of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's workforce. Republican Senator Markwayne Mullin defended the firings on ABC.
We hate that anybody's losing their job, but at the same time, we know that the debt that we have.
We hate that anyone's losing their job, but
Cutting
fuck 'em.
10% of the federal workforce could save about $800 billion over 10 years. But that's just a fraction of the $70 trillion that will be spent by the government if current levels hold. Terminations also swept across the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Food and Drug Administration. And in a purge of the Department of Energy that totaled nearly 2,000, hundreds of employees at the National Nuclear Security Administration were also fired.
Who needs them?
When the Trump administration realized that they had fired engineers who oversee the country's nuclear weapons stockpile, they scrambled to reverse course. The firings for almost all of the nuclear security workers were rescinded. Of the more than 300 who were originally fired, fewer than 50 were dismissed as of today.
And Laura, the firings seem to be haphazard across these many government agencies. Do you have any more clarity based on your reporting as to how these layoffs have been carried out?
Yes, there's been a lot of chaos and confusion. One example, RFK Jr., the new Secretary of HHS, verbally rescinded the firings of more than 900 workers with the Indian Health Service. And that's very similar to the Nuclear Security Administration, as we mentioned. And I spoke to one of those fired workers who was in the field for the Nuclear Security Administration. They ended up getting their job back, but this worker said that they felt as though the firings were heartless and that they became a civil servant because they wanted to serve the country in this way, acknowledging that there's usually more money in the private sector. Across agencies, we should note, Jeff, that a lot of these workers got the exact same kind of termination letter saying that their performance was not adequate, which those workers, a lot of the workers that I spoke to said they felt wasn't fair because they had recent performance reviews that said that they were doing a good job.
You mentioned that you've been speaking to these fired federal workers. I know you spoke with
you mean they
an employee
even
of the
fired them
Department
in
of
the
Veterans Affairs
lazy
who was
way
let
possible
go.
to tell
and
them
I remember
that they're
covering
lazy?
back in 2014 the wait time
All these
scandal
firings are
where
barely
the
going to
VA
touch the
had
budget.
covered
I
up how
know.
long
And when you
veterans
try
were
to
waiting
talk
for
to
care,
people about it, they're
and
just
that
going to
had
talk to you about the
large part to do
transgender
with
musicals.
staffing issues. So what's the impact of these firings on the VA workforce?
Exactly, Jeff. I spoke to Andrew Lennox, a Marine infantry veteran who deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan, and he started his job just in December at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And Andrew said that getting that job was like coming home.
I shared an elevator with an Army vet that saw my Marine keychain and slapped my back, called me a jarhead, and welcome home. And it felt right, and it felt good that I was gonna contribute back to my family, my tribe, my people.
Andrew worked on exactly those things you were talking about, Jeff, behind the scenes, on payroll, billing, managing schedules for doctors and nurses, making sure that he was cutting out that red tape so that way there were shorter wait times for patients, for them to see patients. And Andrew warned that the firings could have a big impact on the Veterans Affairs core mission.
It's going to result in worse care, or not the quality care that the veterans deserve. It's going to turn into burnout, fatigue, and just lack of quality care.
Andrew told me that he doesn't feel that he can afford to join any potential lawsuits that may come from this, but he questioned President Trump's support for veterans because of the number of veterans like himself who have been fired.
The Department of Health and Human Services, as I understand it, has also been affected by this, and you spoke with someone at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. What did they have to say?
I spoke to Ariel Kane. She was laid off on Saturday over the weekend. A third of her team was fired. She worked with state Medicaid agencies to improve maternal health outcomes and lower costs. And she said that gutting programs like hers could end up affecting the lives of everyday Americans, potentially in a life-threatening way.
We are not in this work for a profit. The people that we serve are the most vulnerable, whether they're senior citizens, whether they're pregnant women like my program, or whether they're low-income people or people with disabilities. That's who we're motivated to serve, particularly in HHS. I worry, where do these people go? If they have to turn to the private market or a private health plan to solve all these problems, and they're expensive patients to cover because they have their high needs, I worry about the impacts.
Ariel Kane said that the pregnant women who rely on Medicaid, that her program helped. Part of that was just helping them with increasing access to midwives or helping rural hospitals who maybe need to grow their obstetrician units. And so it's also worth noting, Jeff, though, that the U.S., according to a report from Commonwealth Fund, has a higher maternal death rate than other Western countries, including France and Canada.
All right, so 2 final questions here, Laura. One, do you have a sense, based on your reporting, of when these layoffs, these firings will end? And then what agencies are set to be affected next?
So several hundred Federal Aviation Administration probationary employees are being laid off, according to the labor union that represents them. And this is less than 3 weeks after that midair collision at DCA, which killed 67 people. I'm also told by my sources that hundreds of FEMA workers are expected to be laid off as early as today, and that as well as Pentagon workers. We could see firings happening amongst the civilian workforce at the Pentagon as early as today and throughout the week. So this is not going to end with probationary employees. Sources across agencies tell me to expect firings far beyond these employees who maybe only worked for the federal government for less than a year, and that the people that Musk's team are going to target are workers who have anything to do with diversity programs or climate change programs.
Thanks for this really important reporting, Laura. You answered a lot of questions here for us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
The day's other headlines begin in Toronto, where a Delta Airlines plane crashed while landing at Pearson International Airport. Footage from the scene shows the plane upside down on the snowy tarmac. The FAA confirms all 80 people who were on board Flight 4819 from Minneapolis were evacuated. At least 19 people were injured. 3 of them are in critical condition. A temporary ground stop was put in place at the airport, though service has since resumed. It's at least the 4th major aviation incident across North America in just the past month. Officials now say at least 12 people have died from severe storms that swept through the South this weekend. One person died in Georgia from an uprooted tree that crashed into a home. And unrelenting rain that submerged entire communities killed at least 11 more across Kentucky. Floodwaters also submerged parts of West Virginia, Georgia, and Tennessee.
Too hard.
Kentucky's Governor Andy Beshear said that at least 1,000 people stranded by high waters had to be rescued. And he stressed that the full toll of the storm is still not known.
We are still in the search and rescue phase of this emergency. We still have multiple different missions that are underway. There are still people that are in harm's way.
Farther west, the 10th and coldest polar vortex of this season is descending onto the Rockies and northern plains, bringing what forecasters call life-threatening cold. In parts of North Dakota, temperatures are expected to plunge to 50 degrees below zero when factoring in wind chill. Northern Texas could feel as low as 0 degrees starting tomorrow. In the Middle East, the Israeli military says a drone strike killed the head of Hamas's military operations in Lebanon today. The attack comes on the eve of an already extended deadline for Israel's withdrawal from the country under the terms of November's ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah. An Israeli official now says that forces will remain across 5 strategic locations beyond tomorrow's deadline. Hezbollah's leader said they have no justification in doing so.
On February 18th, Israel must withdraw from all Lebanese territories which it occupied during its aggression. If the Israeli army stayed in a certain location, this means that it is occupying the location where it remains after it did not implement the agreement.
Meantime, families of Israeli hostages marched to the Knesset in Jerusalem today to mark 500 days since their loved ones were taken in the October 7th Hamas attacks. Some 70 Israeli hostages remain in captivity in Gaza. Of those, around half are believed to be dead. And more than 48,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Gaza since Israel launched its air and ground war there. That's according to Gaza's health ministry. In Rome, doctors are now treating Pope Francis for what they say is a polymicrobial respiratory tract infection. 3 days after the pontiff was admitted to the hospital with bronchitis. In a statement, the Vatican said
all
the
that
infection
vaping.
presents a complex clinical picture
That's what happens when you
that
vape
will
too hard.
require an appropriate hospital stay. They did not say how long that could be. All weekend, well-wishers laid flowers outside the Gemelli Hospital where Pope Francis is being treated.
Are we
the
all forget-
88-year-old
Yeah, of
has
course.
a long history of health problems, though the Vatican says he remains in good spirits.
Peace through strength.
And on this President's Day,
And,
a rare
you know, all he
artifact
has
from the
done
nation's
is acted
first
tough and
commander-in-chief
to immediately
is being
show
put
his
up for
belly.
sale.
Or
The letter from
fucking
George
Chihuahua
Washington
diplomacy.
to a subordinate is dated May 7th, 1777, when he was leader of the Continental Army. Written across both sides of a single piece of paper, Washington addresses a recent British raid on a military supply depot in Danbury, Connecticut. He writes that the attack could actually help inspire the American people to arms. The asking price for this piece of history, $150,000. Still to come on the NewsHour, European leaders are left scrambling after the U.S. proposes talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. Tamara Keith and Amy Walter break down the latest political headlines. And an Oscar-nominated documentary exposes the horrifying abuse of Native children in Canadian residential schools.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
President Trump's social media post over the weekend, "He who saves his
Whoa,
country
the
does not
asteroids in
violate
this
any law,"
cluster
implying that
sure
he is
are
above
fucking
the law,
active. They just
triggered
doing a little
alarm bells
dance
from
over here,
experts
huh?
who were already concerned about the legal and constitutional boundaries tested in President Trump's first few weeks in office. Kim Lane Shepley is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University. She studies the rise and fall of democratic governments. Amna spoke with her earlier as part of our new series on democracy.
Kim Lane Shepley, welcome
What's
back to the
going on?
NewsHour. Thanks for being here.
Very nice to be here.
So many of President Trump's actions we've seen so far that are already being challenged on the basis of their legality or constitutionality, these are things he promised to do, said he would do as president. He would say now this is what voters want him to do, and so he's doing it as fast as he can through executive orders. How do you see it?
Well, it's true. A lot of these are things he promised, but democracy isn't just about getting elected and meeting promises. You have to fulfill the promises if you're going to do them in the proper legal way. So what he's just been doing is signing a lot of executive orders, and a lot of these executive orders directly conflict laws passed by Congress. They directly conflict with constitutional provisions. And that's not the way that you can do it.
This is also a president who has praised strongmen in other countries, authoritarian leaders in other nations, people like Vladimir Putin in Russia, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary. As someone who has lived in both Russia and Hungary, are you seeing patterns here that mirror what you saw there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing about these strongmen leaders is that what makes them strong is that they've managed to escape legal constraints on their power. So they've neutralized their parliaments so that they don't talk back to them. They've captured their courts so that they don't override them. They've altered the election law so that no one can get rid of them. And that seems to be the model that Trump is really finding very attractive. And so what he admires about them is that they have been able to govern essentially in an unconstitutional way. And you see him now really going after the constraints on his own executive power.
We've also seen the targeting of very specific groups like immigrants and transgender people. Is that something you've seen before?
Absolutely. Picking scapegoats is partly a way of generating public approval for people who don't like the scapegoats. But it's also a way of saying to people who might challenge this government, this could happen to you. You know, so if you step out of line, you can see what happens. You fall into this abyss of arbitrary treatment where the law cannot protect you and where we are going to come after you. So it's really a way of generating fear, not only in the targeted categories, but beyond the targeted categories to people who are not on board with the president's program.
And Kim, as someone who looks at how leaders govern and lead in these ways, are you seeing something markedly different in Trump's second administration compared to his first?
Trump 1.0, I mean, he just flailed around. You know, he had a lot of ideas.
Flailed
But he
around.
didn't entrench himself. He didn't attack the institutions. So he sort of dropped government on the floor, but he didn't try to completely change the way it operated. Second time he comes back and he's got lawyers. Everything is legal. That's why you see the flurry of executive orders. You see these memos going out saying the president has commanded this in law. And so he's going after the civil service, for example. And civil servants who work from one government to another, from Republican to Democratic administrations and back again, are used to having somebody say, this is now the law, you follow it. And so this is where he's trying to get the civil service to completely change the way the state is organizing itself. And those people who are not willing to do that, he's offering that they be displaced, fired, put on this kind of imaginary leave, and so on. And so he's trying to really control the bureaucracy, doing it by law. So he's got lawyers this time. That means he can do way more damage than he could do the first time.
In the countries that you've lived and studied strongmen and authoritarian leaders, what have you seen in the way of a public response to some of those actions? And did it shift anything? Was it able to sort of slow the decline in democracy or reverse it?
People who experience this have to know what they're seeing. And so in Hungary, for example, which was one of the first countries where it was just this blitz of everything everywhere all at once, people were so disoriented. And everybody was being hit in different ways. You saw everyone just trying to protect themselves, their own group. They didn't really unify. They didn't know what they were experiencing. So when it happened a few years later in Poland, then the Poles knew, aha, this is how the Hungarians did it. And you saw them rise up. You saw them try to defend the independence of the judiciary when it was being attacked. There was way more civil sector mobilization because they understood what was coming. So the problem we have in the US is that Americans haven't seen this before. So they don't know what it means. They don't know what it adds up to. They think it's Trump 1.0, but Trump 1.0 didn't do as much lasting damage as Trump 2.0 has already done in the first few weeks.
We should also say the U.S. is not Hungary. It's not Russia. It's not Brazil. There are people who say our democracy is different, and it's not susceptible to many of those same forces, that Trump couldn't do here what Putin did in Russia or Orban did in Hungary. What do you say to that?
Well, there's something to that because the U.S. government is very big. It's very complicated. There are lots of choke points, lots of institutions, things have to pass through. And the simpler a government is, the easier it is to knock over. We think we have all this protection. But think of the kind of protection we have. The separation of powers and our federalism sort of depend on every institution at federal level defending itself and its own prerogatives. It relies on the states defending themselves and their own prerogatives. But what we have now is something that some law professors have called not separation of powers, but separation of parties. And so if you get a party that is as organized as the present Republican Party is, the Republicans in Congress will defend the Republican in the White House. The Republican judges will rule in favor of the Republican in the White House. The Republican governors will also jump on board. And so the institutional protections really fall apart when you have this kind of party discipline that runs through all the institutions, and then the institutions don't provide the checks anymore. So the U.S. is way more vulnerable than I think our classic separation of powers model really would lead us to believe.
Kim Lane Shepley of Princeton University. Thank you. We really appreciate your time and insights.
Glad you're working on this topic.
Today, the Trump administration's top national security officials are all in Saudi Arabia ahead of a meeting tomorrow with Russian officials that marks the beginning of Ukraine peace talks. The fact that those talks are bilateral has sparked deep worry across Europe, especially after comments by senior U.S. officials in Europe over the last week critical of U.S. allies. Here's Nick Schifrin.
In Riyadh today, a meeting with Saudi Arabia's powerful crown prince before negotiations begin to end Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II. Tomorrow, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and Special Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff will meet with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Putin's Foreign Policy Advisor Yuri Ushakov. No Ukrainian or other European officials. which led Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky today during a visit to the United Arab Emirates to call the talks illegitimate.
Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as ones that have no result, and we cannot recognize any agreements about us without us.
This weekend, President Trump assured that Ukraine would not be sidelined.
Do you expect Zelensky to be involved in these conversations? What will his role be?
I do. He will be involved.
I'm a school of realism.
But at the Munich Security Conference, Special Envoy Keith Kellogg made it clear other Europeans would not be invited because he said previous European-led ceasefire negotiations had failed.
There was a lot of people at the table that really had no ability to execute some type of peace process, and it failed miserably. So we're not going to go down that path.
Today, Kellogg briefed NATO about what he called partnership with Europe on ending the war. But some Europeans today worry the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner. And leaders today rushed to Paris, where President Emmanuel Macron held an emergency summit. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov called the European kettle black.
If they continue scheming some tricky ideas as they usually do, and just intend to continue the war, why invite them?
This afternoon, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called this a, quote, difficult situation for Europe, and that peace talks for Ukraine must produce a fair and sustainable peace. For more on those Ukraine talks and the U.S. relationship with Europe, we turn to Gabrielis Landsbergis, who was Lithuania's foreign minister from 2020 to 2024. Thanks very much. Welcome back to the NewsHour. After hearing Vice President Vance this weekend give support for right-wing parties across Europe, and after hearing Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth last week saying the U.S.'s primary focus could no longer be in Europe, you argued this. You argued that neither Europe nor Ukraine can trust the U.S. to provide security or assistance. Why do you believe the break is so fundamental?
Well, because in Europe, we've never heard these sort of words spoken after the alliance was created. So clearly, this is really shocking to many of those who wish to join this alliance, because we did not have this opportunity to do that when it was created, and by joining it, we believe that it's fundamental. It's ironclad, that nothing can fracture it, nothing can break it. So listening to those words, it really, in many cases for the people, on Eastern flank, this is even emotional, I would say, like the change or an end of an era.
So when you see Special Envoy Kellogg go to NATO today and talk about, quote, partnership, when you hear Secretary of State Marco Rubio this weekend call the transatlantic alliance, quote, vital, do you just not think that that is the U.S. policy anymore?
The question is that in the face of biggest geopolitical calamity in the continent, since the Second World War, people might start doubting whether the alliance still works as it has, as we've set out for it to work, or as we planned for it to work. So this is the biggest change. We have war just a couple hundred kilometers from where I sit, and it's if there's anything that I would like to do is to reassure people of Lithuania that that U.S. has our back, that NATO is strong, and nothing has changed. But the questions are there.
After the conference, you also wrote that to be invited to the table when it comes to Ukraine talks, you have to matter. And then you suggest Europe can build its own table. How?
Well, look, I mean, I've heard, ministers and European leaders asking United States not to forget Europe, invite us to the table. And, for me, it just sounds sad. We shouldn't be asking this. Right? We are a continent of 450 million people, enormous economy, enormous economical power and financial power. Clearly, just, we've been asleep for a very long time. And if there is a time to wake up, so it is now. We wake up, we start financing our defense, where we can start financing Ukraine, and then we build the table. We support Ukraine, but we would say that, look,
Someone yippee dog.
yeah,
barking.
the times, might change, the alliances change, but,
His
we have your
background is
back.
fucking
And,
insane.
I have full confidence that Europe is able to say that. The only thing that is lacking or could be lacking is political will.
But with all due respect, European leaders, including yourself, even French President Emmanuel Macron, have been screaming from the rooftops that Europe has to take this more seriously, that Europe has to do more. Why do you believe that this moment could prove any different than these previous attempts?
Indeed, it is one of the last calls, to wake up. If this doesn't wake up, well, somebody might declare that the patient is actually dead. One has to be worthy for its own freedom. So it is indeed a very dark, potentially a very dark hour for Europe, because the consequences of us sleeping through what is happening now could be detrimental. Clearly, in Munich, it was seen that that China is very much interested in everything that's happening in Europe. But now, seeing how many meetings did Minister of Foreign Affairs of Public PRC had with European leaders, had with institutions, some of the countries were waiting for years to meet the Chinese leadership, and suddenly, just during this Munich, they got this possibility. I wonder why? Because they see the fractures in transatlantic union, and they want to drive the wedge even further. And they can emerge an actual winner from this war. So the West, EU, United States, might lose the war, not just to Putin, but also to China.
Gabriela Slamburgis, thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, don't stall.
In the last two presidential elections, farmers voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. But now some farmers are saying his efforts to cut the government are causing major financial pressure. William Brangham has more.
Jeff, two of the biggest changes affecting farmers are a freeze on some USDA programs and a near shutdown of spending by USAID, which buys about $2 billion of products from farmers every year. About 40% of the government's food assistance comes from American farms.
Oh my God, investigate,
Others
investigate.
say they're on the hook for contracts for renewable energy
Ridiculous.
equipment that the government promised to help with.
On
We talked to
console,
several people
you just
in this
press
field.
A.
A flower farmer, a beekeeper, a produce farmer, and the CEO of a nonprofit that delivers food aid to children in Haiti.
Slowly, we've figured out that we've lost about a quarter to a third of our funding, and we have no sense of whether some of those pauses are permanent or temporary, or when that money can or will come in.
We've worked with USAID in several capacities in the past, usually through key partnerships we have on the ground in Haiti. And so with the absence of that, it really sets things back significantly.
If it goes past the next couple of weeks, we're really going to be in a tight spot. We're really probably going to have to either add more debt to our mortgage, or we're going to have to seriously consider closing up shop and not operating.
We received a grant from the government about a year ago, and that's when we signed this contract for a solar panel system on our new barn. We still owe about $36,000 to the solar company that was supposed to come from the government. We never would have signed a contract with the government for these solar panels if we thought we'd be paying the full amount.
We're looking about $40,000 in losses, and then about $20,000 in additional income we won't be able to make, so about $60,000 in loss as we calculate it right now, and then about $115,000 in potential grant funds that we now know we won't be receiving for 2025.
If this never goes through, we would look to lose about $45,000, and the impacts for us would be pretty detrimental. We're one of the larger winter grain growers in Maine, so we grow a lot of spinach, kale, and chard this time of year that helps them stock their shelves with fresh produce this time of year that can be hard to get in Maine. So what that means for them is they're going to run out of a supplier to have those options.
When funding that is dependent on at this level is cut and cut so quickly, we underestimate the impact that it makes throughout the world and the potential lives that may be lost and the talent that may be lost.
The fact that this business I've been building for 7 years, this career I've been building for 12, is now under attack by the people in the executive branch of the federal government who are supposed to look out for American interests and are instead looking out for the interests of the 1%.
Already, farmers are shrinking their businesses, and I'm really afraid about the future of farming if all these programs just go away.
For some further perspective on all of this, we are joined now by Nick Lewandowski. He's the executive director of the Kansas Farmers Union. Nick, thank you so much for being here. You heard all of those complaints that people are making about the way in which this federal cost cutting is unfolding and impacting them. How common is that to what you're hearing from your own members?
It's very common, William, and thank you for having me, and thank you for covering this important topic. I've had conversations here over the last couple weeks now with members and farmers all across Kansas and frankly all across the country through the connections I have with National Farmers Union. And there is great concern all across the country, and it just adds more uncertainty to an already uncertain situation.
For people who may have been somewhat surprised that there was this connection between American farmers and USAID, can you sort of explain that broader mechanism, how it works?
Yeah, well, we take great pride in especially a certain part of USAID, the Food for Peace program here in Kansas. It was born here back in 1953, signed into law by another great Kansan, Dwight D. Eisenhower, in 1954. And it was brought about because we had a glut of commodities or grain crops here in the U.S. We were producing more than we needed and could consume, but there were also places all over the world, especially in Europe, that was just recovering from World War II. So we were sending those products over there. And since then, that program has fed upwards of 4 billion people in the 70-some years that it has been in existence. But farmers grow the crops here in Kansas, and they deliver that product to those places all across the world.
I mean, in addition to those financial stresses, there's also some other looming things coming down the road. I mean, there's inflation that they're obviously dealing with, commodities prices, et cetera. How much cushion do farmers have to weather this financial storm?
There's very little cushion. You mentioned the cuts that are happening, the freezes and all of those things. But those high cost inputs are what's really hurting right now. The seed, the chemicals, the fertilizers, the fuel that is needed, farm equipment is extremely expensive, and bankers are not loaning out tons of money to farmers right now. In fact, bankers are pulling back. And then you throw in the idea of more tariffs, a trade war, and then the cuts to positions at USDA just at the end of last week. Crucial positions in the Farm Service Agency offices, the NRCS offices that are all over the country. These are folks who are integral to American agriculture, and those positions are now gone, and people that were working in those offices have now had to pick up more of the slack.
We asked the White House about some of these criticisms, and this is the statement that they gave us. They wrote, "The Biden administration crushed American agriculture with regulatory uncertainty, crippling inflation, trade imbalances, and radical environmental policies. Thankfully, President Trump is already delivering relief by unleashing American energy and cutting 10 regulations for every new regulation. He will continue to make all agencies more efficient to better serve the American people, including our hardworking farmers." I mean, the White House is arguing, in essence, that they were elected to do this and that these policies are what what the American public more broadly want. How true is that for your members?
Well, I don't think there's a whole lot of truth to their statement. Blaming the past administration, I think, is an odd way to go. If you're in charge now, it's your job to take this on. I would say, though, that there are a lot of people who are very concerned out there who voted for this administration. But, they wrote it all down in Project 2025. I guess we should have paid a little closer attention to what was in that. I read the agriculture section. I know it better than I probably should. But it was there. It was all in writing. We probably should have paid closer attention to it. I'll just say this: I think it's time for this administration to recognize who put them into office, and also to understand that these people are hurting, and this.
This video was brought to you by Henson Shaving. In the last couple of years, there have been various pronouncements coming from both ends of the political spectrum that Germany's once powerful left party, or Die Linke, was dead or dying. Last year seemed to confirm the left's demise. Its former parliamentary leader split to found her own party. The left suffered disastrous results at Germany's state elections and looks set to entirely lose its already limited foothold in the German parliament at the upcoming federal election. However, with that election now less than 10 days away, the left's fortunes appear to have unexpectedly changed, and the party's enjoying a last-minute surge in membership and a rise in the polls, taking them above the crucial 5% parliamentary threshold. So in this video, we're going to explain why the left has seemingly come back from the brink, and why its resurgence could complicate Germany's post-election coalition formation. If endless bad news is getting you down, then you might enjoy our rather silly series, TLDR's Race Across Europe, where the TLDR team competed to meet as many audience members as possible across the continent. The whole series is linked in the description. We should probably start with a bit of background on what the Left Party actually is. While the party was officially founded in 2007, it has a much longer history, as the Left Party is considered to be the democratic descendant of the Socialist Unity Party, or SED, that ruled East Germany prior to reunification in 1990. Generally considered to be far left to left wing, the Populist Party's traditional stronghold has been the former East, where it was most established and garnered support from left-behind voters, and where it has been the head of, or at least a junior partner, in various state-level governments. Now, we'll keep this story brief, but the left suffered decline throughout the 2010s, particularly as it was displaced in East Germany by the far-right AfD. Rudderlessness and infighting in the Left Party culminated in a public split, with ex-parliamentary leader Sarah Wagenknecht founding her own eponymous party in 2024, which could have been the nail in the coffin for the Left Party. But has the party actually turned a corner? Well, it certainly looks possible. Since the beginning of 2025, more than 23,000 people have joined the Left Party, pushing its total membership beyond 81,000, beating its 2009 record. Obviously, this suggests that the party is anything but dead, something that's also backed up by its polling. The party was polling at around 3% at the start of the year, but it has risen as the election draws nearer, with it hitting as high as 6% in the most recent round of polls at the time of writing, even overtaking the relatively new populist left conservative Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, or BSW, whose support has fallen from its highs last year of around 9 to 10%. So what has the left's strategy been to fuel this apparent comeback? Well, for starters, with the goal of winning over frustrated left-of-centre voters, the left has attacked the unpopular SPD and Greens, accusing them of failing to combat the country's cost of living crisis during their time in office. As such, the party has put economic security, affordability and redistribution at the front and centre of its election platform, calling for the scrapping of VAT on basic foodstuffs and a wealth tax to combat inequality, to name but a few policies. But that's not been the party's only notable pitch. The Left Party has also pitched itself as a bulwark against the country's apparent rightward political shift, for instance on migration, vowing to give, quote, not an inch for the fascists. In fact, it's perhaps this factor that's been the greatest boon for the left, which has managed to capitalise on recent political events. In late January, the conservative CDU-CSU was able to narrowly pass a parliamentary motion urging for a crackdown on migration thanks to the votes of the AfD. This sparked a political firestorm, as, for the first time, it marked an undermining of the firewall around the AfD, which saw mainstream parties refuse to cooperate with the far-right party. While opposition to the CDU-CSU breaking that taboo came from many sides, including from within the CDU, as well as from the SPD and Greens, perhaps the most powerful and far-reaching condemnation came from the Left Party's joint lead candidate, Heidi Reicheneck. Her fiery speech aimed at CDU leader Friedrich Merz went viral, racking up more than 6 million views on Reichenek's TikTok alone, and a total estimated 30 million across various platforms. In fact, it was actually on the day of the vote and Reichenek's speech, January 29th,
Some
that
might
the left
still
saw
tell
its
you it's
largest
not real.
surge in new members. This forms part of what looks like a pretty strong online strategy from the left, which is likely to help the party with younger voters. In fact, the average age of the party's new sign-ups is 28, and they lean 53% female too. One recent poll shows the left as the joint most popular party, with the Greens, among 18 to 29-year-olds, with 19% support, a massive improvement on the 8% support that they got from that cohort in the 2021 election. The party has doubtless benefited from new leadership too, having replaced its previous co-chairs last year with Jan van Aken and Ines Schwertner, and drafting Heidi Reichenek to be the new co-lead candidate with Van Aken. They are also hoping to recapture some of the traditional Eastern heartlands by standing 3 veteran left politicians as part of the so-called Mission Silverlocks, a tongue-in-cheek reference to the 3 men's average age of 70. The mission's dual purpose is to win 3 constituency seats, which means that even if the party falls below the 5% threshold, it would still be awarded seats corresponding to their vote share. Now, it's worth doing a bit of a reality check here. We've obviously been talking a lot about the relative resurgence of the left, not the kind of dramatic swing that would see it surge to a podium position. Even securing the 6% that they're currently polling would still not be a fantastic result for the left by historic standards, so it might seem that this is sort of an irrelevant story. But that's not the case. Firstly, it will be higher than the party's 2021 result and a rapid improvement on the past year's polling, demonstrating just how quickly electoral trends can change. Secondly, the momentum that the party is enjoying right now could be carried through to the next parliamentary term, especially if strong communicators like Reichenek are returned to parliament, although its newfound optimism cannot forever mask the persisting political rifts of the party, for example over Israel-Palestine. Finally, the left, or indeed other smaller parties winning parliamentary representation, will impact the forming of the next government. If none of the 3 smaller parties, the left, BSW and FDP, make it into parliament, then the currently first place CDU would likely be able to form their favoured option, a 2-party coalition with either the centre-left SPD or Greens. However, if 2 or 3 of the smaller parties secure representation, then it may force the CDU to form a 3-party coalition. This is considered by the CDU to be far less desirable, as it would weaken their leverage and would come with the kind of inevitable infighting that's plagued the now collapsed 3-party coalition led by Olaf Scholz. So the performance of the left and its fellow smaller parties should indeed be closely watched, because their success could be supremely irritating for the CDU's plans. Although irritation is something all too familiar for anyone who shaves regularly. In fact, lots of people actively don't like shaving,